各位觀眾，歡迎收睇自由亞洲電台嘅特備直播節目。今日我哋將會同大家全程跟進喺美國國會而家進行緊嘅由香港自由委員會基金會主辦嘅第二屆香港峰會。咁今年嘅呢一個即係香港嘅研討會呢，係有3個討論環節啦。咁第一個討論環節就將會去講23條之下嘅香港新聞自由。第二個環節就會講北京點樣利用香港作為規避制裁嘅一個工具。第三個環節咧就會講香港喺而家呢個喺科技嘅環境之下呢，就點樣係會被北京利用作為一個軍民兩用技術嘅一個轉口嘅一個港口。咁除咗剛才介紹嘅3個環節之外呢，主辦單位亦都邀請咗共和民主兩黨嘅參眾議員去做一個開場嘅致辭啦。咁所以今日總共呢應該就會由而家一直到下晝12點到啦，我哋會同大家一直全程去直播。咁我亦都會盡量嘗試補充一下相關嘅資料啦，希望可以幫到大家就更加了解討論嘅背景啦，討論嘅話題啦等等嘅。咁講翻呢個香港自由委員會基金會啦，佢其實係由2021年成立，而今年嘅呢一個香港嘅研討會咧 Hong Kong Symposium 已經係第2屆主辦。咁但係我哋就係第一次就同大家係現場直接去跟進呢一個研討會啦。咁而家我哋見到大會現場嘅畫面啦。
In Hong Kong and around the globe. With that being said, I would like to hand this over to our first speaker today for opening remarks, our chairman, Ambassador James Cunningham. Ambassador Cunningham served as ambassador and deputy permanent representative to the United Nations from 1999 to 2004, and consul general for Hong Kong and Macau from 2005 to 2008. After that, he served as ambassador to Israel and Afghanistan consecutively. Ambassador Cunningham, welcome to the podium. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you everyone for joining us today and for your continued interest in opposing repression in Hong Kong, and that resistance matters. Hong Kong shows what China's vision of the future is. It's control, repression of freedom, bullying, threats. It's a rejection of the vision that most people in the world, I'm convinced, would prefer. A freedom of expansion, a freedom to move around, a freedom of thought, freedom to build their own lives coupled with prosperity. Today's Hong Kong, there are 1,800 plus political prisoners, most held for years without trial, collapsing freedom and growing intimidation across the board. And today we'll hear a great deal of new information about the negative trends in Hong Kong, many of which are not just wrong and immoral, but actually are impacting our interests going forward. The United States government just issued a revised business advisory. It warns that the risks to U.S. firms operating in Hong Kong are now increasingly the same as they face in the PRC. Risks to their staff, to legal compliance, to finances, reputation, and operations. And just today, Jimmy Lai's international legal team filed an urgent appeal with the U.S. Special Rapporteur on Torture over the conditions being imposed on Mr. Lai and on others in Hong Kong jails, including in Jimmy's case being held in solitary confinement for over 3.5 years. That is a crime under international law. We have to confront what China is doing in Hong Kong, first because it is the right and decent thing to do. As importantly, we also do that in defense of our values in our own political and economic interests, which are becoming increasingly imperiled in Hong Kong under China's control. We must bring China to see that imposing Xi Jinping's vision will ultimately damage, not advance its interests. The Chinese government made negotiated commitments in Hong Kong to the people of Hong Kong and to the international community. We owe it to ourselves and the people of Hong Kong, and ultimately even to the Chinese people, to refuse to accept the betrayal of Chinese promises now in Hong Kong and in the future. Hong Kong today cannot play the role of Asia's world city that so benefited China in the past, despite the claims otherwise of the Chinese Communist Party and its acolytes in Hong Kong. In that regard, I commend the House for the almost unanimous passage of legislation on Tuesday to close Hong Kong's economic and trade offices, which today represent not a Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy, but Beijing. And I'm very pleased that Senator Merkley and Representative McGovern were co-sponsors of that piece of legislation. I'm hopeful that change will come to Hong Kong. It can begin almost immediately with an end to show trials and the release of Jimmy Lai and the many political prisoners that are languishing in Hong Kong jails. And I want to thank Senator Merkley, Representative McGovern, and Representative Kim for joining us today and for their continuing interest in this fight against repression. Thank you.
好簡單咁講下啦，頭先就係
Thank you, Ambassador Cunningham.
自由基金會嘅
Our next
主席
speaker, I'm sure
Mark
needs
Cunningham，
no
佢以前喺香港做過
He is the original
駐港總領事啦。
co-sponsor
咁佢大概今日亦都講翻就係美國政府最近亦都對香港對美國嘅公司咧提出一個警告咧，就係話如果去香港嘅話就會有若干風險啦，包括實質風險同名譽上風險啦。佢亦都有提到黎智英嘅法律團隊咧，亦都向咗聯合國咧提請咗㗎啦。咁啊，而家我哋睇下第二位嘉賓發言啦。
Key organizer here. This is the second year, and this movement of paying attention and fighting for freedom in Hong Kong is so important. And there's kind of an unusual feature to this event, which is you're here on a topic in which you have bicameral and bipartisan support. And I just want to acknowledge, you'll be hearing from them in a moment, but I'm so pleased that colleagues from the House are here, Jim McGovern and Congresswoman Kim. Thank you, and to Christopher Smith, who I don't think is able to join us today, but is very much in the spirit of this battle. So you have a foundation for the work you are doing that is not true for many of the issues that we wrestle with here on Capitol Hill. And to the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, Ambassador Cunningham and President Clifford and Director Stivers, well done in continuing to carry this movement forward with your leadership. As co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, I was honored to be with you last year and to be here at the second anniversary. And I think any anniversary, anytime you're here in DC, and I continue to be in the Senate, I expect to be here in partnership with all of you carrying this fight forward. As you all wrote in the last report, the latest report of the Committee for Freedom, Hong Kong has become unrecognizable from its prior role as a reliable partner in maintaining the international order and stability. We know how the Chinese government has imposed its authoritarian will on Hong Kong, police beating peaceful protesters, the so-called national security law making a mockery of the rule of law, turning a city of freedom and opportunity into a city of fear and oppression. We know how the Chinese government has made more than 10,000 political arrests, and the number of political prisoners being held is now, was that the 1888 number you're referring to? 1,888 political prisoners, including names that reverberate across the landscape like Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong and Gwyneth Ho, but so many more. And we know how the Chinese government is trying to reach the long arm of authoritarianism into the United States and into other countries, what Freedom House calls this Chinese operation, the most sophisticated global comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world to silence dissent and intimidate critics. And it includes the bounties that Francis was referring to, million-dollar bounties on information leading to the arrest and detention of those who have been leaders in this fight for freedom. This oppression is unacceptable. There are 3 bills that I want to see on the desk in the Oval Office. First, the bipartisan Hong Kong Judicial Sanctions Act that Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan and I introduced. The bill would impose sanctions on Hong Kong officials, judges, and prosecutors who have used the national security law to strip Hong Kongers of their basic human rights. Anything you can do to help get this passed, we appreciate you being here on Capitol Hill to help make that happen. Second, the bipartisan Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act that Florida Senator Marco Rubio and I introduced. The bill would ensure the Chinese government can't abuse Hong Kong's special diplomatic status now that it has crushed its autonomy. And, of course, in this case, kudos to the House of Representatives that voted on Tuesday, 2 days ago, 413 to 3 to pass this bill introduced by my Congressional Executive Commission on China, Representative Chris Smith and Representative Jim McGovern. 413 to 3. I don't know who those 3 are, but let's talk to them.
We do.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Often you have a lot of meetings to have to thank people. Thanking 413, we may not be able to do in person, but it really was a great victory. And third, the bipartisan Transnational Repression Policy Act that I introduced along with Senators Rubio, Cardin, Haggerty, and others. This bill would ensure that U.S. government has a tool and resources to stop all governments, including the Chinese government, from abusing human rights on U.S. soil. Like we've seen with the bounties on activists and the secret police stations and the even physical confrontations, including at last year's APEC summit in San Francisco, in addition to your recent support, shows how the Chinese government and other authoritarian governments like Russia and Iran and North Korea are using Hong Kong to evade economic sanctions. This is a significant and growing problem that Congress needs to address. At the beginning of my report, I quoted your report. At the beginning of my remarks, I quoted your report. It says Hong Kong has become unrecognizable from its prior role as a reliable partner. Your report goes on to say that we, quote, must act quickly to adjust to these new circumstances or else Hong Kong will solidify its role as a key destabilizing force in the world. This is a message that members of Congress need to hear. They need to be reminded, as they're weighing and working on so many issues here in America and around the world, that Hong Kong has gone from a partner to an oppressor. It has gone from a human rights defender to a human rights disaster. It has gone from a beacon of freedom to an island of oppression. But we're here today because we must never give up on the dream of a free Hong Kong, and we will continue working together in partnership, activists, members of Congress, to make that happen. Thank you.
Senator Merkley, thank you so much for your time and your long-standing support for our movement and the Hong Kong people.
剛才發言嘅係美國國會入邊美國當局同國會中國委員會嘅聯席主席麥克利，咁佢當中特別提到一點呢，就係唔容許中共借用香港作為規避國際制裁嘅一個工具嘅。咁下一個發言嘅呢，就係 Jim McGovern。佢亦都係 CECC， 即係呢個美國當局同中國委員會嘅一個成員。
Senator Merkley, I appreciate his leadership, and Representative Kim, thank you. I look in this audience and I see a lot of friends who have been working on this issue for a long time, and a lot of heroes. And I appreciate your work. I'm somebody who believes that the United States of America stands for anything. We need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And this is a room filled with human rights activists who feel passionately about this issue. And I appreciate the invitation to join you again this year to analyze Beijing's continuing crackdown on Hong Kong and think through U.S. policy options. The further deterioration of human rights and rule of law in Hong Kong during 2024 is a tragedy. A year ago, this community had to face the consequences of the PRC's efforts to intimidate and silence exiled Hong Kong activists by placing bounties on their heads, a clear example of transnational repression, and that repression persists. Then in March, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region issued their Article 23 National Security Ordinance under orders from Beijing. This new law adds more offenses that supposedly endanger Hong Kong's national security, like the vaguely defined crime of external interference. It subjects those accused to extended pretrial detention. It restricts their rights to consult with their lawyers and to obtain bail, and it doubles down on transnational repression, for example, by revoking the passports of Hong Kongers who are forced to flee. It is a terrible, terrible national security law that has been widely criticized internationally. After the law was approved, Radio Free Asia closed its office and removed its personnel from Hong Kong. Radio Free Asia has been in Hong Kong since 1996. In May, 16 activists went on trial on charges of conspiracy to commit subversion. They were part of the Hong Kong 47, and it's an inspiring multi-generational group of politicians and elected lawmakers, protest leaders, academics, trade unionists, journalists, and medical workers who led and participated in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement up until their arrest on January 6, 2021. Of the 47, 31 pleaded guilty. Of the 16 who chose to go to trial, 14 were convicted, and the government is appealing the 2 acquittals, all awaiting sentencing. It is not news that the PRC has tried to eliminate all public space for debate and dissent in Hong Kong over the last several years. That is the real purpose of these so-called national security laws, basically to silence any dissent that may be raised. That is why today there are nearly 2,000 political prisoners in Hong Kong. But those of you in this room today have not stood by silently. You have organized and you have advocated for policies to impose costs on Chinese authorities for their blatant human rights abuses. And we in Congress have sought to be wind at your backs. This week, the House passed H.R. 1103, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Certification Act, authored by my colleague, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey. That vote was nearly unanimous. Again, I want to find out who those 3 people are. It drive me crazy. But anyway, but the next step is the Senate. The next step is the Senate. The Hong Kong government has already denounced the bill's passage as gross interference with the internal affairs of Hong Kong. But here's the thing. Standing up for human rights is not interference in domestic affairs. It is the obligation of every government to defend against human rights abuses wherever and whenever they occur. Countries acquire that obligation when they ratify human rights treaties, as China has done, and as the U.S. has done. The PRC conveniently forgets that fact. But in addition, why should the PRC be bothered by the HKETO law? After all, its objective is to turn Hong Kong into just another part of China. There is no serious remaining commitment to the principle of one country, 2 systems. If China is no longer bound by that principle, then neither is the United States. If Hong Kong is no longer governed by common law, if its judicial system no longer upholds the rule of law, then there is no reason for the U.S. to continue to treat it as if it does. The Biden administration sent this message last March when Secretary Blinken issued the annual Hong Kong Policy Act report and again certified that Hong Kong no longer warrants special treatment under U.S. law. If the Chinese authorities want special treatment for Hong Kong, they must restore Hong Kongers' rights and freedoms. They must restore rule of law. And they must also release all those unjustly imprisoned under the national security law. In the meantime, Congress will continue to enforce U.S. law as it applies to Hong Kong, including sanctions law. We are seeing increasing reports that Hong Kong is becoming a hub for sanctions evasion. That is unacceptable. and I look forward to working with my colleagues in this body to find ways to hold those responsible accountable, and we will do that. And let me just say something off script here. The bills that are really holding China to account are bills that have come out of the House and Senate with huge bipartisan support. They have resulted in Democrats and Republicans working together, working with Chris Smith, Representative Kim, Senator Merkley, Senator Rubio. I mean, we have worked on language to make sure that we have bills that, in fact, will get the overwhelming majority of support in the House and Senate. We are having China Week in the House of Representatives right now, and I say this as a word of caution. I wish that the people who have been working on all these successful China initiatives, Representative Kim, Representative Smith, and Senator Rubio, Merkley, I wish we were all responsible for, like, writing the language for all the bills coming up. Because one of the things I regret is some of these bills basically have been written in a way where there is a partisan divide. And I think that sends the wrong signal to China when there are major splits on important votes. I mean, the bill that Congressman Smith drafted passed overwhelmingly. I mean, it is a strong signal of where Congress is at. We need to do that on all bills related to China. And we can't politicize this issue. It has to reflect our principles and our values. As I said at the beginning, if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. There should be no distance between anybody on these issues of human rights. And what's happening in Hong Kong is a tragedy. And as we move forward, we need to make sure that in the spirit of the bill that was passed the other day, we continue in that approach. And so I, again, thank everybody here for your work. I know that people who are suffering from repression in Hong Kong know all the work that you are doing and appreciate it. It gives them hope that the future will get better. But please know I will always be wind at your back, and I'm honored to be here speaking to all of you who I have so much admiration for. So many thanks, Francis. Thank you.
剛才發言嘅係亦都係
Thank you, Congressman
當局同埋
McGovern.
國
Thank you
會
for your remark, and we're so
委
grateful
員
for
中國
your
委員
so
會嘅成員麥嘉文啦，咁佢有講兩個重點啦。第一個重點就係中國如果想香港繼續有特殊地位嘅話，就必須還香港自由。第二就係佢希望兩黨呢能夠就住中國嘅各種法案呢，係能夠有一個完全嘅共識，以向中共呢發出強烈嘅信號，話俾佢知呢，其實美國其實喺中國問題上邊係有一個明顯嘅共識嘅。
Please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Yang Kim.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to thank the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, Ambassador Cunningham, and everyone involved with the committee and the staff. Thank you so much for your advocacy. I represent California's 40th Congressional District that's located in Southern California, and there are many, many Hong Kongers in my district. And over the years, as I worked for over 2 decades as a congressional staff, I work with the Hong Kong community, especially Hong Kong Association in Southern California, and I have come to know and respect a lot of the work that you do. And during my time as a staff in 1997, I traveled to Hong Kong to witness the handover. At that time, there was a lot of optimism. Fast forward to today, as Senator mentioned earlier, Hong Kong is not the same Hong Kong when I witnessed that handover in 1997. It's just unrecognizable. So much so that the work continues. When I got elected to Congress, I made it a point to work on advocating for human rights, not just for those who are fighting here domestically, but for around the world. That's why I was delighted when I came and I joined the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I serve as your chairwoman of the Indo-Pacific. this is an issue that is dear to my heart, and I will continue to put human rights on the front burner. The national security law, enacted more than 4 years ago, gave the Chinese party the endless power to prosecute, intimidate, and jail pro-democracy Hong Kong activists. Beijing's coercion went further in March with the enactment of Article 23. That was a devastating blow to the peaceful and pro-democracy movement. So, as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Indo-Pacific, I will work tirelessly to hold the CCP and those who enable that regime accountable for repressing freedom in Hong Kong. So, working closely with your committee, I introduced the bipartisan Hong Kong Sanctions Act to hold Hong Kong officials accountable for human rights violations and to stand with Hong Kongers facing scrutiny under Beijing's national security law. In response to that bipartisan, bicameral charge to hold them accountable, Beijing resorted to what it knows best: bullying, coercing, silencing dissenters to keep their grip on power. And a pro-CCP lawyer, as you know, filed a petition for the court to allow anyone, not just police, to arrest me in Hong Kong if I put my foot in Hong Kong for condemning Beijing's illegal use of force against peaceful pro-democracy activists. Unbelievable. But I refuse to be intimidated and silenced, and I will continue to use my voice to fight for the freedom-loving people of Hong Kong. The CCP's authoritarian reach extends far outside Hong Kong's borders. We must remember that a threat to freedom anywhere is a threat to freedom everywhere. I'm proud to lead the Hong Kong Sanctions Act, and I will not let anyone keep me from getting that bill across the finish line. I want to thank you again for the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation for the opportunity to speak today, and for everyone here for your continued advocacy and for your important work. So keep knocking on those doors where you go and find out why those 3 members voted against this very, very important bill this week. If you have time, stop by to thank the members that supports very important work and standing with you. They need to hear this, as well as putting some more pressure on those who are not standing with us. Thank you so much for doing what you do. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Young Kim. It's such a powerful speech, and it's so nice for you to come by.
剛
And
才
thank you
發
for
言嘅
coming
係
into the Hong
加
Kong
州嘅眾議員殷謙啦，金翠影玉。咁佢剛才嘅其中一個重點就係佢會係推動喺國會入邊呢有2黨嘅共識，係一個制裁所有同23條以及國安法相關嘅中港官員嘅法案。
After China imposed the national security law in Hong Kong in 2020, it left many people around the world wonder, what is happening in Hong Kong? And what can we do abroad to combat the CCP's threats to human rights and international security? Now let's watch a video as we move forward to the next part of our symposium.
Historic 2019-2020 pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, Beijing imposed a national security law that destroyed freedom in the city and criminalized what the Chinese authorities describe as secession, subversion, terrorism, and colluding with foreign forces. Soon after the law came into effect, Hong Kong authorities undertook mass arrests of pro-democracy leaders and activists throughout the city, where freedom and rule of law were once respected. This also led to the shutdown of pro-democracy news outlets, including Apple Daily and Stand News, and the arrest of their senior editors and journalists. The founder of Apple Daily, 76-year-old Jimmy Lai, has been in prison for more than 1,300 days in solitary confinement. In his national security trial, he faces the possibility of being sentenced to life in prison by Beijing's hand-picked judges. Today, independent press in Hong Kong continue to face scrutiny and surveillance by the authorities. According to Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, Hong Kong dropped from being one of the freest in 2003 to 135th place in 2024 out of 180 countries, just next to other nations that are hardly seen as democracies, like Oman and Algeria. Any open dissent is quickly crushed. Hong Kong authorities continue their crackdown on free speech, even trying to ban the protest song Glory to Hong Kong from digital platforms across the world. People who don't salute the flag or stand for the national anthem are jailed. All Hong Kong students are now required to take courses that promote obedience to the Chinese Communist Party, even in faith-based schools where those values contradict their religions. Earlier this year, the Hong Kong government imposed a second, repressive national security law known as Article 23 to cover what it considers treason, sedition, and state secrets, and allow for trials to be held behind closed doors. As civil liberties continue to be repressed, many people and businesses have left Hong Kong. Despite living abroad, Hong Kong authorities have expanded their repressive actions by attempting to hunt down prominent activists overseas and carry out surveillance through its outposts around the world. A decade ago, Hong Kong had no political prisoners. Today, it is estimated that there are nearly 1,900 people languishing in Hong Kong prisons, ranging from 13 to 76 years old. Hong Kong courts are holding the baton of the crackdown for the CCP in lengthy mass political trials. Judges and prosecutors contribute to the oppression of Hong Kongers by lending credibility to the regime's imprisonment of dissidents. Among the judges on Hong Kong's highest court, 3 of them are from the UK and 4 are from Australia. The deterioration of the rule of law in Hong Kong is a threat to international security, allowing Hong Kong to become a global smuggling hub for brutal regimes like Russia, North Korea, and Iran. The Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation recently published a groundbreaking report illustrating how Hong Kong entities, with the support of the Chinese government, are evading U.S. and international sanctions to provide key technology for the Russian war effort and needed goods and money for Iran and North Korea. This year, CFHK has produced a collection of research reports on religious freedom, sanctions evasion, foreign judges, and Chinese investments in British universities. We are working together with U.S. and international decision makers on policy recommendations to help the people of Hong Kong. Our work has impact. Just 3 weeks after our report on foreign judges was published, 3 resigned from Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal. CFHK Foundation continues to drive discussions around the world on protecting Hong Kong's autonomy and freedom through policy advocacy and education. We will work to get political prisoners released and will continue to press for accountability for the CCP's assault on freedom that imperils Hong Kong's status as an international financial center. The Hong Kong people struggle under an oppressive regime. They need the international community to speak out as they are silenced. That's what we do at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Give a voice to the freedom-loving people of Hong Kong. Make no mistake, we will work to strengthen the U.S. and international response and hold the CCP accountable for its crimes against the city.
All right. What a great informative video that is just perfect to set the tone for our upcoming discussions. As journalists and media executives continue
好
to
簡單咁講翻頭先嘅影片啦，咁主要係介紹翻香港自由委員會基金會喺過去做過嘅工作啦。咁其中包括出版咗幾份報告，關於香港嘅宗教自由，關於香港嘅言論媒體自由，同埋其中一份呢，就係講香港點樣被北京利用作為一個規避制裁嘅地方。咁一陣間其實喺跟住落嚟嘅討論環節咧，都會觸及到呢啲題目嘅。
The moderator of this panel is Mark Clifford, CFHK Foundation's president and the author of a forthcoming biography of Jimmy Lai, the troublemaker, that is coming out this December. We're honored to have Alexandra Bielakowska from Reporters Without Borders, who actually flew from Taipei to here yesterday, and Anna Kwok, the executive director of the Hong Kong Democracy Council. Welcome to the panel. I will just note that at every panel, at the end of it, we will try to have Q&A. But if the conversation with the panel speakers goes really well, we might not have it, and we might also interrupt in the middle of it because we know that the Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi is coming soon. Thank you.
Sorry.
今日嘅
Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks, Francis. Thanks to all the members who were here this morning, Ambassador Cunningham, the staff. But special thanks to our two guests who have been briefly introduced, and you can see longer bios in the program booklet. And both of them have had experience with the sharp end of Chinese power. Alexandra was denied entry to Hong Kong recently, where she simply was trying to attend court proceedings. And Anna Kwok is one of those lucky 13 who's subject to $1 million Hong Kong bounty for her arrest and detention and prosecution. So these are people who really know what they're talking about. They also specialize, particularly in the case of Alexandra, in media. So I thought what we'd do today in the session would be to talk a little bit about what's happened and especially what is happening, and above all, what we can do to follow in the kind of advice that Ambassador Cunningham was giving about how we can continue to stand witness, stand up, and prepare the day for a better, freer Hong Kong, which I hope all of you share my belief that that day will come. So why don't I turn it over to you, Alexandra, to kick things off?
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. To give you maybe also the context of our work, because I think Reporters Without Borders are not so well known in US. We have our bureau here, but we mostly work in Europe, and we have the bureaus and sections in 30 countries around the world. We've bureau that I came from Taipei. We opened it in 2017, and because of the close distance to Hong Kong, we had a chance to observe very closely through our network, also through our correspondents, which are still operate in China and in Hong Kong, the situation that is happening right now in Hong Kong. And as Mark shortly said, the media situation has really significantly deteriorated since 2020. And you can see this, and it was also presented on the video, that in the RSF Press Freedom Index that we annually release, Hong Kong has fallen from 18th place in 2002 to 135th in this year, which is a huge downfall. I think if you compare it to other countries around the world, this is something that was unprecedented globally for any country and territory to fall so much in our RSF Press Freedom Index. Not to mention that Hong Kong also became a jail for journalists, and this is also something new because in the modern history of Hong Kong, we never saw the journalists being detained in Hong Kong, and just in the scope of 4 years, we count at least 4 journalists and press freedom defenders detained currently in Hong Kong, including Jimmy Lai, the Apple Daily founder, also Gwyneth Ho, who is the former journalist of Stan News, for instance. But this is not the end of it, because Hong Kong, with this very shameful remark, has become at the same time one of the biggest prisoners. It's 15 places around the world for journalists. Yeah. Should we?
Yeah, I think we have Speaker Pelosi coming in, so we'll take a little break.
Sorry to interrupt. As you heard the news, Speaker Pelosi is here. I'm sure she needs no introduction again.
今日
She is a
嘅
powerful
會議咧
voice
有
for
個
human rights around the world.
特別嘉賓呢，就係
Especially speaking out on
佩洛
issues
西
affecting
Pelosi，
Hong
咁
Kong,
佢就
Uyghur, Tibet
將
people
會
who
係
are oppressed by China.
即係會作出發言嘅，咁佢而家就行緊去個演講台啦，咁我哋一陣間就睇下佢有啲將會有啲咩分享。
From Martin Lee to Ensign Chan to Joshua Wong, who is currently behind bars under the national security law. It's truly no exaggeration to say that she is a steadfast defender of human rights and democracy, and she never stops. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in honor in welcoming our next guest speaker, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your leadership. Thank each and every one of you for the role that you are playing for freedom in the world and the connection with what's happening in Hong Kong in terms of sanctions regarding Ukraine and the rest of that. Yes, I have. Thank you so much for acknowledging for decades worked with Martin Lee to begin with years ago, vis-a-vis Anson Chan, counter to Chris Patton, whom I just visited at Oxford, and they all agree that we were right then, and that the Chinese have not lived up to their responsibilities in terms of the basic law and the rest. But what I thought I would just mention today, because there's so much that you are doing, the depth of your knowledge and breadth of your commitment to just make change there. That we can't. This is a ridiculous thing. This so-called law. They shouldn't even be called laws. They are criminalizing democracy in Hong Kong is what they're doing. Criminalizing any fight for human rights or decency. But the long hand of China reaching out of China to London, to San Francisco, and other places where activists for democracy in Hong Kong have demonstrated in the protest and the rest is something that we really as a country have to make a statement. It's bad enough what you do in your own country, and we have been criticizing that for a long time, but don't think that you're going to curb freedom of expression in other countries. And they're violent. They're violent. They beat up people and the rest of that. I mean, I met with Nathan Law, met with some in London when I was there, when I recently met with Chris Patton as well. So this is, it's a small place geographically. It's a special place in every possible way in terms of courage, in terms of democracy, in terms of economy, in terms of so many things. Excuse me, I have a sniffle. I think it's the rug down here. It happens, Marco. But having a big impact. And I think there's several agendas at work. I think China wanted to make Shanghai be the central economic city and the rest, so they try to diminish what was happening in Hong Kong. But imagine the courage. Joshua Wong, you mentioned being in prison. I met with him here. So many people. I mean, for decades we've been meeting. John Stivers is here, John, and Carolyn Bartholomew. Is Carolyn here yet? I know she will be here.
On her way. On her way. She's on the next panel.
She's on the next panel. But anyway, two people who had been on my staff who just take these deep values that we all share to the policy place. So we're pleased. We lost 3 votes on the bill the other day. So I went up to some of these people and I said, did you know what you were doing? What are you talking about? Well, one of them said to me, no, I didn't realize I voted no. It was a mistake. So I think that we're as close to unanimity as possible on the legislation. It wasn't some other thing happening. It was just somebody made a mistake. And usually we round them up and all, but they voted at the end and wrong. But nonetheless, they're with us on all this. But so thank you for what you do, because this is more than symbolic, but it is a symbolic fight for democracy in the world. It's a place where China has, I mean, with all the terrible things they're doing to the Uyghurs, to the culture and language and religion in Tibet, to democracy in Hong Kong, to freedom of expression throughout China, the threats to Taiwan and the rest, because they're, I mean, one country, two systems, you must be kidding. If they were serious about that, they would have treated Hong Kong in a much different way. So that's all to say. I come to salute all of you for what you do. Thank you for what you are doing. Let me know any more things that we can be doing to keep the pressure on. The Chinese government knows we are not going away. We are not going away. And there has to be a path back to democratic values being respected in Hong Kong. But again, the people who have left Hong Kong, I've had my criticisms of the British government at the time of the transition, trusting something that we knew somebody couldn't be trusted, but hopeful. But the visas, you know, some of the things they're doing now, helpful. But again, shining the bright light of freedom on what's happening there, but none of it would be effective without the courage that all of you are demonstrating in your various aspects of it, whether it's Hong Kong directly, freedom, and quite frankly, we have our own freedom issues in our own country. So, but the one thing I can say is that we do have strong bipartisanship when it comes to issues that relate to human rights and violations of them in China, especially as was manifested on that vote on Hong Kong. So thank you for what you're doing. I know I'll get a report on the panels and the rest. I've read the intellectual resources you are bringing to bear on this. I think that this meeting is going to make a big difference. I look forward to seeing the results of it all. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And you had Andy Kim and Jim McGovern and Senator Merkley, and I know that many others have deep commitment to democracy in Hong Kong as well. Thank you so much. Thank you.
剛才就係榮譽議長佩洛西咧就發言啦。咁佢最主要講嘅就係話，香港雖然一個好細嘅地方，但係香港係一個好重要嘅地方。而家中國將香港嘅民主變得刑事化，變成一個罪行。咁佢就話美國係喺呢個情況必須要出聲，而且更重要一點就係中國喺海外嘅各種長臂管轄呢，係必須要正視嘅問題嚟嘅。尤其是當中國喺海外嘅長臂管轄，好多時都係涉及咗好多暴力啦。咁所以佢話佢同兩黨嘅議員其實對於人權問題，尤其是就住中國嘅人權問題，其實係有個好明顯嘅共識，對香港嘅問題亦如是。咁佢喺頭先嘅分享入邊都有講到，有提到一啲人物啦，其中有提到黃之鋒啦，咁話佢曾經喺度見過啦。咁所以其實佢剛才主要都係鼓勵翻兩黨嘅成員同埋香港人繼續為民主去奮鬥落去嘅。
You have done in the past couple of decades for democracy in China and Hong Kong. So sorry for the interruptions. We will come back to the panel on media freedom and internet freedom and the Article 23's impacts on that. Thank you so much sorry for the interruption.
No problem. No apology needed. Thank you, Francis. Thanks, of course, to Speaker Pelosi. And back to you, Alexandra. You ready to? Okay.
So hi, everyone. I'm Anna, Executive Director of the Hong Kong Democracy Council. Just to remind everyone, in case you were charmed by the Speaker Emeritus speech. But for my very brief opening remark, I think I can speak from my experience from doing advocacy for Hong Kong and Hong Kongers on the Hill, as well as diaspora building and community empowerment work at HKETC. To reflect on the implications of losing that sense of media freedom in Hong Kong, right? So we always talk about media freedom. We always know it's a bad thing to lose it. But what does it actually mean for advocates, for people in Hong Kong, for Hong Kongers who are still trying to work on Hong Kong? So I kind of deduce 3 stages of seeing that loss of media freedom from the past 5 years since the 2019 movement. So I would say since losing media freedom and since seeing less and less news freely reported in Hong Kong, the first stage of grief, you may say, is actually you see the vacuum of information in Hong Kong. You no longer know, where to look for news, where to look for information about what is actually happening. And even when you receive a piece of information, you have to think twice before figuring out, okay, is this the truth or is this something fabricated by the government or planted by, pro-CCP, pro-Hong Kong forces? And secondly, afterwards, after maybe like 1 or 2 years of figuring out where do I get information now, we come to the stage where we see a vacuum of narratives. We don't really see new rhetoric, new stories, new narratives being told about Hong Kong anymore. Now, when we look at Hong Kong, it's constantly a battle between the Hong Kong SAR government and people like us who are still trying to be loud overseas. But Hong Kong used to be this vibrant story with a lot of shades of gray in between. But now it's often only a battle between the black and white. And you have lost the voices of people who have been silenced, people who are still trying to fight on the ground. They cannot say a word because once they say something and once they're discovered and found out that they said something, they will be arrested immediately. And with that, eventually, once we lost that sense of a unifying narrative, a narrative that Hong Kongers resonate with, we have this psychological vacuum in Hong Kong. And it's not only for Hong Kongers who are still in Hong Kong, but also Hong Kongers who are around the world. We have this psychological vacuum that, first, we don't really know what is Hong Kong anymore. We don't really know how to relate to Hong Kong, and we don't really know what constitutes Hong Kongers anymore after 5 years since the 2019 movement. I was speaking to some people who recently left Hong Kong, and they told me once they came outside, when they started seeing, reading, hearing things from people like us, they were shocked. They were shocked that we would so openly say something like, we are fighting for the freedom and democracy for Hong Kong. And they were shocked that we're still chanting the slogans from the 2019 movement. They were shocked that we're still proudly announcing that we are Hong Kongers. To them, this is just completely unthinkable. In just 5 years' time, they completely lost the sense of saying things freely just because they don't see these things reported on the news anymore. Last November, I was in San Francisco protesting against Xi Jinping. And during that time, if you have seen a report we recently published, we encountered a number of transnational repression, assaults, intimidation, a lot of these tactics from the Chinese government. And when we were getting beaten up by pro-CCP thugs on the streets, just 3 blocks away, the Hong Kong SAR government were actually meeting with business leaders in San Francisco. And they also invited Hong Kong local media all the way to San Francisco to report on these meetings and instances. But then they were also given the order, according to my understanding, that media were not allowed to mention any of our names. They were not allowed to report on instances that were happening to us, Hong Kongers, protesting for Hong Kong. And since the bounty that was given to us last year, we were also told that we're told by the government that they should just treat us as we are non-existent. They can no longer mention our names. They cannot mention Anna Kwok, Joey Siu, Francis Ho in the news reports in Hong Kong. So that's the kind of reality we're seeing right now with media freedom. And with that, Hong Kongers outside, Hong Kongers inside, no longer share the same set of reality, right? We're all scattered in our different sense of what is happening in Hong Kong, what is Hong Konger, and that actually obstructs some sort of possibility of a movement forward. So this is just, coming from the experience. I want everyone to understand and try to get into the shoes of us, trying to fight this fight when we lose media freedom. And that's why it's really important that we talk about it today. And it's really important that we also try to legislate policy actions, and empower the community to build that bridge of communication, media information flow going forward. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll have a little more discussion, then I'll open it up to Q&A. Alexandra, you have been in Hong Kong more recently than any of us because you were an observer at some of the trials last year. You also recently were denied entry to Hong Kong, so you're probably not going back anytime soon. Could you talk a bit about both of those?
Yes, of course. And actually, maybe let me start with the first mission, because we traveled to Hong Kong twice. We succeeded to go to Hong Kong in the past year. It was, I think, June or July 2023 when we first entered Hong Kong. The reason why we didn't go for a long time was actually not related to what happened in Hong Kong. It was more related to Taiwan and the COVID restrictions at the time. And we decided that it's about time for us to check if we can still enter the territory, what we can face when we will enter territory, what is the situation of the journalists on the ground, and if anyone would like to speak with us, because this was the question that we first asked ourselves. And of course, make sure that everyone that we meet with was secured and decided to go with it. But for me, what was surprising with the first mission was that from all the journalists that we approached, everyone agreed to meet with us at the time. And it seemed that people didn't understand, in a way, what is the red lines. They wanted to check if NGOs can enter Hong Kong, if they can speak with us freely. They wanted to check if NGO started to be also one of the red lines, or it's still possible for us to enter. And what struck me the most during this conversation is that there's still a number of journalists which are trying to do the job. It's very difficult for them because most of the media outlets actually were closed down, with Apple Daily, with Stan News. I think about dozen smaller media outlets open up with 1, 2, 3 staffs to basically try to keep following the news, and they try to cover some subjects. But it's very difficult for them to continue this work. And there's a few reasons for that. I think one of the most important reasons is that they don't have sources anymore. So they try to cover the news, they try to speak about some sensitive topics, but whenever we spoke with them, they said that some people are currently in jail, so they cannot speak with them. There are not any more sources in the administrative institutions. The other part is that many people decided to go on exile, so also these people are not sources anymore for them, while other people are basically very terrified and they don't want to speak with them anymore. So this is one of the reasons why it started to be very difficult for them to continue the work. The second part, of course, is the red lines that line upon them in a way, that the fact that they try to do the work, but they're afraid that if they will cover specific subjects, they might be also put under threat of being subjected to national security law, or even other charges like sedition that was recently used against other media outlets. So I know, for example, that there are some media outlets that try to operate, but they have a legal team that is telling them what they can write about and what they shouldn't touch. And it's really very difficult and long process because they need to go into every detail of the new Hong Kong legislations and try to figure out if covering specific topics can be considered a crime or not. And how they do it, for example, for me it's quite interesting to say that they cannot cover the news about what the outside world is telling about Hong Kong. But if the Hong Kong government is making a comment about it, then they can cover this news. So, for example, when I was deported from Hong Kong, they couldn't say anything about it until the Hong Kong authorities and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China decided to comment in the press conference and basically give their comments to the media at the time. Another thing that we have faced when we met with the journalists on the ground was the fact that they really struggle with finances, with sustaining. They cannot get subscriptions anymore because they're afraid of getting money outside of the borders, because this can be also considered as collusion with foreign forces. The fact that Stan News and Apple Daily disappeared and so many of them reappeared afterwards, it's very difficult for them to get the same amount of viewers and readers to read the content. So for them, the most biggest threat right now is to how to sustain, how to get money to continue working. This is another reason why they struggle on a daily basis. But of course, the more terrifying parts of that, because people are being followed, people are being harassed, threatened. The family is also threatened, not only online, but also physically sometimes. And this type of harassment is day by day seen more and more in Hong Kong, which also impedes the work.
You talk just a little bit about your experience when you weren't able to get into Hong Kong.
So this is actually also interesting for us because we've been able to enter twice. First time was to meet with the journalists and to attend one of the trials, Stan News trial, when we attended one of the hearings at the time. Stan News is one of another media outlet that was shut down by the government in 2021. Then second mission was on December 18th, and the reason for the mission was to go and to attend the first hearing of Jimmy Lai. So we wanted to be in the court. We managed to get in the court. At the time of the hearing, we'll be sitting together with Jimmy Lai family. We've been the only NGO present at the time. We need to queue up at 4 a.m. to basically make sure that we can get into the queue, because Beijing has a tactic of sending people to the queue to make sure that nobody who is trying to support the Hong Kong journalists can enter the court. But we managed to do so. This trip was quite different from the first one because I was traveling with my the manager of Reporters at Borders on projects and development, and for the first time we felt that something is not okay. Why I'm saying this is because we've been at least 3 times followed. During one of the meetings, we saw someone seated next to us making notes from everything that was said during the meeting. So we saw that this time the attention was caught by the authorities, and they, for the first time, wanted to know what we're doing here. For me, interesting thing is that we don't understand why the first time there was no interest like this. It's only the second time. My assumption is because we were in the Jimmy Lai trial at the time, and I think this was a very sensitive moment for them. Jimmy Lai trial is something that they really are afraid of. They're afraid of public attention to it. So this was the first time that they're starting to pay attention to what we're doing in Hong Kong. And then with the third mission that took place, I think it was April 10th this year, which was not successful this time. I've been traveling with the bureau director who actually entered Hong Kong, and he managed to go to the territory, and I was stopped at the border. I was questioned for around 6 hours, interrogated. Also, they searched me many times. They asked a lot of questions. Also interesting, not about press freedom, but mostly about Taiwan, what I'm doing in Taiwan, what is my relation with Taiwan, how many colleagues in Taiwan we have in the team, this type of questions, but also what is my role at Reporters Without Borders. And then after 6 hours of this very unpleasant experience, surrounded by around 10 to 12 policemen, plainclothes policemen, they decided to detain me officially and send me back. Interestingly, they at any point said to me that I can have a lawyer. Apparently my consulate, because I'm the Polish citizen, said that they couldn't reach me for this amount of time, but my colleagues were trying to get in touch with them, and they were trying to basically take care of me at the moment. And they decided to send me as soon as possible to Taiwan, from which I came, without giving any reasons for my detention, deportation, because this is something that I was specifically asking a few times. Whenever I was supposed to sign some documents, my question was, why are you doing this to me? Why the person that is just simply going to attend the trial meeting with the people is going to be detained and deported? Because we don't break any law. We are basically there to monitor and do the NGO work, something that they say that is okay, and the same to speak with a journalist and to support them. And I think we don't say this is the end for us, but I think for RSF it will be very difficult to go back physically to Hong Kong right now because they have us in a way under the radars currently. But we still try to continue our on-ground work. We still try to do things that we've been doing for the past 3 years. We do capacity building for journalists. We train journalists. We trained around 1,000 Chinese-speaking journalists to date from Hong Kong and China. We try to continue the emergency assistance support, so whenever someone needs quick relocation to other country, lawyer support, fees, we can also provide this for journalists. And we still try to be present, even if not personally, through our contacts, through our networks, through our correspondents that still work on the ground.
Thank you for that, for the important work you do. And I think, it's easy to focus on the problems you've had, but I think the reaction of the Hong Kong and Chinese governments to your work shows just how important it is and just how important the work that all of us are doing to keep, as Speaker Pelosi said, keep shining a spotlight on these, this really dirty, thuggish, bullying behavior. They're afraid of publicity. They're afraid of the international spotlight. We have about 10 minutes or so in the session, so I'd like to, we can keep going a little bit if you've got a lot of questions or if there's more to say, but like to at least open it up to Q&A. If people have questions, please raise your hand. We've got some mics. Mark Lagon, can we have a mic? Grace, can we have a mic for Mark, please? Or take Mark.
Thank you. I'm Mark Lagon. I'm on the board of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. Dziękuję bardzo. I wanted to ask you, for your perspective, do you think that the idea that there are journalists who are political prisoners has penetrated people's understanding? I think people understand that things have gone backwards in Hong Kong, around the world, but is your sense that that striking fact is taking hold outside of PRC and the Hong Kong region itself?
I wouldn't be so optimistic about it, if you can say optimistic, because I saw a lot of attention in the first 2 years when it happened with closing of Apple Daily, closing of Stan News. There was a lot of media attention, a lot of attention in legislative bodies in UK, US, and other places. But what I see right now, and I think the fact that the trials are so extended in time, that everything is being delayed, that people cannot pay attention to it anymore because they think that it's basically boring and nothing happens in the courts, made it very difficult for people to relate to it and to keep following on the cases. And I think, I don't know if Mark, you would agree, but even for us, it's starting to be very difficult to keep advocacy on those cases because not many people are relating anymore what's happening in Hong Kong. Maybe Anna, you can add something to that.
Sure. So right now, Hong Kong has 1,888 political prisoners, according to a database that we have been running since 2022. And of course, a lot of them actually, a number of them are journalists, but that's usually not exactly acknowledged. The most famous case or the most well-known cases that we know about is Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, and Stan News. But then there are actually still a number of smaller independent outlets that got shut down, and journalists, citizen journalists that started reporting in 2019 that got arrested. But because they did not have such a big portfolio, they were usually not spotlighted. So I think it's important to recognize the trend and the phenomenon that is happening, that is journalists and reporters actively getting arrested. Just last week, there is also one journalist who's still trying to be active in the city, Alan Au. He is supposedly, hosting a lecture in CFHK, a university in Hong Kong. But then when school started 1-2 weeks ago, suddenly he was put on leave without any explanation. So this sort of behaviors and actions by the Hong Kong government is still happening, and we do need to shed an important light to it and see it as it is. So it's very important, the work that you all are doing.
And maybe just to add to Alan O, actually, we are also very concerned because he was one of the people that were arrested during the Stan News raids. And the question right now is appearing what will happen if the two editors-in-chief will get sentences. He might be the next person to be actually imprisoned, and this is also something that we need to keep in mind, that right now everything is delayed because the court did not give yet verdicts about specific cases, but what will happen next? This is something that is very important because they will have a means, they will have a precedence in courts to go after other people. And this is something that I think concerns me the most right now, and the fact that we really don't know yet the extent to which the government will go with the new Article 23, the new national security legislation. I was myself detained and deported after Article 23 was implemented, so my guess is that the Article 23 had some implication on it. There was another German NGO worker that was detained and deported from Hong Kong, I think it was just 5 days ago. So the cases are really racing day by day, and for me, when this situation happened, too many people started to reach out to me, and they said there's so many journalists from US, from other places that are being denied, they cannot enter Hong Kong anymore, but nobody speaks up about it because they're afraid of some persecution publicity to the media that they want to still be in Hong Kong and continue work.
The case you just mentioned, the German, was particularly ironic because he had come from Beijing. So he's led into China, and he's not led into Hong Kong. So I think that shows you, people used to worry that Hong Kong would become another mainland city, and I think we can be clear, it's much worse. It's more like a Xinjiang or a Tibetan city, I think. Do we have more questions in the back? You're a very shy audience. Why don't we talk a little bit about diaspora media, because this is something that's really new and I think quite exciting. I mean, what technology has allowed us to do in media abroad is something that would have been impossible after 1989, which was also time of technological change and inspired Jimmy Lai to set up Apple and Next after he saw what the possibilities that CNN and satellite TV offered starting in the 1980s. But we're in a whole different world now, and I think gives some chances that we wouldn't have had.
Yeah, and maybe not only diaspora, but the exiled media that were set up after the Apple Daily and Stat News was closed. I think to date we count around 10 media like this, operating mostly from UK, from Taiwan. I think there's some media operating from Australia, from US too. And they try to do the work. It's very difficult for them. For some of them, they decide to come to Taiwan, for example, to be closer to Hong Kong because it's the same time zone. It's easier for them to work with the freelancers, still operating from the ground to cover some topics. But it's very difficult for them to continue this work. One thing relates to that is that they have an issue with being on the ground. So they need to cover the news from different perspectives. So what they do, they, for example, interview the exiled activists because they cannot be interviewed anymore inside of Hong Kong. So they give a space for the exiled activists to give voice, to interview them, to give different perspectives on what is happening in Hong Kong, on different advocacy approaches. But we can also see the media outlets which are operating on covering diaspora topics, for example, about what is happening with Hong Kong diaspora in UK, in US. They want to be more closer to the people staying abroad in this new environment and perspective. But they also face a lot of difficulties. First is, and I think the most important fact is that they really lack financial support. For them, when they're forced to leave Hong Kong, organizations as Reporters Without Borders, they can provide them with emergency assistance, so we can give them money to buy new equipment, to buy, for example, pay for the salaries, but this is where our support is finishing. And then afterwards, for them to sustain, it's very difficult for them to do this. Not to mention that many journalists are facing visa difficulties. I know many cases of journalists who are forced to go to other countries. One person that I know very close tried to work for one of the media outlets in US. He was waiting for more than a year, and then he was forced to go to other country. Before he tried to stay in Taiwan, but because his wife did not get visa, he was also forced to go to other country. So they really have a lot of issues, and I think what we need here is general support by the governments to give the refugee schemes, the visa schemes, to give scholarships for these journalists, but also financial support for this media to continue work from whenever they are.
So this morning I was also just speaking to a few diaspora and exile media outlets, and they all shared the same immediate urgent need, which is that they don't have enough funding to continue running. So now it's the point where they have to decide whether they have to shut down and close the media platforms just because of all these operational difficulties. But closing these platforms mean people like us losing one more source of information. Sometimes, we cannot really directly speak to people on the ground, and we have to rely on exile media outlets who still have some sort of flexibility to speak to people on the ground, on background and off the record, to get a sense of what is actually happening. So just an example, when we do our database of the political prisoner report database, we often have to reference all these exile media for their for their media reports, so that we can count, how many people are being arrested again and how many people are put into jail for how long. And they are the ones who get verification and confirmation through on-the-ground contacts. So that just shows, how the information flow works now in the post-NSL and post-Article 23 era. So that means if we lose that exile and diaspora media outlets, it will get even more difficult to get information from Hong Kong, which is unthinkable, knowing that Hong Kong is supposedly this international financial center where, international corporations have their headquarters there. But no, there's no way. It's very difficult to get political information without these media outlets as the middle person.
It's a great point to pick up on, because it is an international, or at least it was one of the key global financial centers. But it starts with political information, but as we've seen in China, and I think as we're starting to see in Hong Kong, financial and business information is also being curtailed. And Hong Kong is really, unfortunately, shooting itself in the foot. It's very, very hard to destroy an international financial center once it's set up. You have networks, nodes that make it impossible to just move easily. But Hong Kong seems like it's well on the way to being the exception that proves that rule. And I think we've seen the performance of the Hong Kong stock market, property market, not really being fully covered, because I think the government doesn't want bad news in Hong Kong, just like they don't want bad news in China. And it's sad, but I think we should really remember and applaud the people like Alan Au and many, many other people who are still doing good work in Hong Kong. And I'm sure that we can keep supporting, we can keep trying to shine a spotlight. The day is going to come. I think, as Speaker Emerita Pelosi said, we're not going away, we're not going back, and we're gonna keep fighting for the day when Hong Kong is freer, and if not fully free. 1,888 political prisoners. I'm sad, also in a way proud to count my 7 former colleagues from Apple Daily there. I mean, it's outrageous. I was still in Hong Kong when the first national security law raid was made, when 250 cops came into the newsroom, terrorized people, took Jimmy Lai away in handcuffs from his house, perp-walked him through the newsroom. Think of the courage of those journalists. The cops were trying to shut the place down. Journalists were live streaming, were interviewing Jimmy as he's being perp-walked through the newsroom. But here we are. Then the cops came back again, of course, and took people away. And here we are 4 years later, 3 years since the Apple Daily people have been taken. 7 of them are in jail. Jimmy, of course, is fighting and refuses to break. 6 other people have said that they will plead guilty. The 6 other Apple Daily, they've pled guilty. They're being held as hostages, effectively, until Jimmy's sentenced, I guess. So I take your point about the trial and the difficulty of maintaining momentum and interest. On the other hand, the trials, when they do start and stop and start and stop, also gives us news pegs and a reason, and they also allow people to be in court and to be able to see supporters and family and friends. So, look, we've been dealt a lot of lemons, and we have to try to make lemonade out of it. And I think that the work that we're doing here, the importance of it, might seem small sometimes, but I mean, it really, we can't overestimate how important it is. But we had a newspaper that had 600,000 digital subscribers, the highest proportion of any city in the world in terms of paying subscribers overnight, because John Lee sent a letter to us, the board of directors and the management, and to banks, saying stop business. You can't process credit card payments from 600,000 subscribers. At its peak, Jimmy and Next Digital were employing 4,000 people. You think of the scale of that. So look, we're not there right now, but I'm old enough to have lived through the Soviet period, the Berlin Wall going up, living in Berlin, and the Berlin Wall coming down. And I mean, it's nice to see so many people of so many different ages and backgrounds and commitments continuing to fight.
Yeah, so I think we're nearing the end of the panel, but I just want to add one more thing, which is that, so when we're talking about media freedom and how we're necessarily having this war of information against the Hong Kong government, it's also important to remember how the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices are now being used as actually sort of an information outlet and propaganda machines. They're writing responses to Wall Street Journal about how Hong Kong is back to normal, how Hong Kong is business as usual, and they're also putting out their narratives after narratives that are basically falsehood, right? So it's really important. I urge everyone to support the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. We still have to go through the Senate. We just landed a great victory on Tuesday that everyone talked about this morning. Really a huge thank you to Representative Chris Smith and Jim McGovern for spearheading this effort. Pierre was here. A lot of colleagues at CECC really worked really hard with us together. HEDC, CFHK, Hong Kong Watch, and many other organizations. The entire community basically came together because the HKETOs is such a huge pain when we try to talk about what really is happening in Hong Kong. So yeah, just trying to urge everyone support. There's a media freedom angle to it, so let me use this panel to urge that support. We just need to get support from Senate in the remaining 4 months of this Congress, so hopefully we can get it passed and we can bring some good news back to the Hong Kong people, because this will be the first legislation to pass after enactment of the National Security Law in 2020, which is also quite unthinkable. So really, hopefully everyone can band together and pass this bill together. Yeah.
Well said. Francis, did you want to make a comment?
I just have a question. That's
question.
Okay. Yeah. If no one else have any questions, yeah. Okay. You guys just mentioned, Hong Kong actually have a worse situation probably compared to the rest of China. And you mentioned the example of David Missel, the German journalist and German citizen who are barred entry from Hong Kong. I think it's very interesting. It would be very interesting for the audience to know about this, as we see an illusion that Hong Kong is kind of back to normal and the Hong Kong government is indeed trying to paint this picture. Can you tell us more about if you have any other examples to show us that, and also why is it important for us to clear this picture and know this reality about Hong Kong?
For me, I may not necessarily say that Hong Kong is as bad as the Tibetan or the Uyghur region, but still, I think Hong Kong is generally now more harsh and difficult to operate in than most part of the mainland China. And the primary reason is because in mainland China, the repression has been so long that people kind of have been figuring out where that red line is. But Hong Kong is constantly changing with where the government's mind is, with what they can say, what they cannot say. And I think it's that part that makes it very difficult to journalists and activists on the ground to continue their operation. Because in China, once you say something on WeChat or once you say something publicly, you kind of have a sense when you're going to be asked for coffee or for tea. But then in Hong Kong, you never know. You just have to try. But the price to try is quite high. So that is why I think the thought policing work in Hong Kong is more intense now and more unpredictable now, which makes it more difficult to operate in, and that virtually also makes it a bit harsher than mainland China as a whole.
I think during our mission, someone told us that there's around 2,000 national security police officers in Hong Kong, and everyone is asking the question what they're doing. who they're looking at, like who they basically trying to follow, what type of information they try to gather about these people. And we know that journalists are the main target because they are being followed, they're being harassed, they're being threatened very often because of what they do. And maybe to finish on my side, I just want to also mention that, yes, the situation in Hong Kong started to be even more blurry than in China, but there are still journalists, Hong Kong journalists, who are trying to do their work. And we cannot forget that, because in China, the investigative journalism, the independent media are almost died out. You cannot find anything like this. In Hong Kong, there are still people who are trying to do their work, but it's very difficult for them to continue doing this. And we need to be there, we need to read the articles, we need to support them, we need to try to advocate for them if there's any threats happening to them, because maybe our pressure will make some difference.
Thanks. I want to finish on a slightly different note, which is a challenge to Hong Kong and international journalists to keep an eye on some of the issues that Speaker Pelosi and others mentioned today. And Anna mentioned the Apex situation. We have stuff going on in America right now that wasn't going on 4 years ago. I mean, we've seen some arrests in New York. We've seen the investigation into the APEC violence. I mean, the United Front and the CCP activities continue to expand. And I think I would say my domestic colleagues need to wake up and need to look at some of the work that the diaspora and overseas Chinese media are doing, because this is very serious and this can't be happening in our country. So let's not take our eye off that ball. So I want to thank everybody. We've had a very wide-ranging panel. I mean, there is obviously a lot of bad news, but I think there's some really important rays of hope, and I hope everybody has a better understanding of what the potential is and what the importance is of what we abroad are doing to support the freedom-loving people of Hong Kong. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you so much. It's such a wonderful and insightful discussion. And Mark, thank you for leading this discussion. And thank you to both of our wonderful speakers, Anna and Alexandra.
咁啊，剛才呢就係今日嘅第一個討論環節。咁主講嘅兩位嘉賓呢，一個就係無國界記者嘅專員白奧蘭，另外一位呢就係HKDC 香港民主委員會嘅執行總監郭鳳儀 Anna Kwok。咁喺頭先嘅分享中段就有加插咗一個環節，就係由國會嘅榮譽議長佩洛西咧就分享咗佢咁多年嚟對香港同埋即係就住呢個議題嘅一啲觀察。咁但係講翻頭先嘅嗰個討論環節啦，咁我見到有幾個都值得去幫大家即係重溫嘅，因為頭先講嘅內容都比較多啦。咁包括第一個就係無國界記者專員白奧蘭小姐咧，佢其實就曾經3次去香港。咁啊，第一次咧就係能夠成功去到香港，而且仲可以同到香港嘅媒體嘅工作者前線呢係有討論到關於嗰個紅線嘅問題。咁佢都講就係話香港嘅記者亦都有同佢表示過，就係喺香港而家嘅工作越嚟越困難，有幾個原因。第一就係佢哋曾經有嘅資訊來源好多已經俾人拉咗啦，咁或者唔敢講嘢。咁呢個就係令到做新聞工作嘅朋友係難咗第一針。第二步就係由於即係佢哋好多都係以公民記者或者自媒體嘅形式運作。咁喺香港而家呢個環境，即係比較難啲去攞到佢哋需要嘅資源，比較難啲去賺到錢。咁最大嘅原因唔係香港人唔肯支持佢哋，而係香港人擔心，如果係課金支持佢哋嘅話，會唔會因此就觸犯咗國安法呢？咁所以呢，令到佢哋喺財政上面到一定困難。咁當然就係紅線嘅 即係漂移，亦都令到佢哋作為記者自己本身都受到好沉重嘅壓力啦。咁但係白奧蘭自從嗰次去完香港，咁啊了解咗情況之後呢，佢哋就第二次再去香港嘅時候呢，就已經開始遭遇到問題。嗰次就係黎智英嘅審訊。咁當時其實佢本身係同佢另外一個無國界記者嘅成員一齊去，佢自己去唔到啦。咁但係佢嘅分享就係話，其實亦都見到香港嘅嗰個壓迫感係越嚟越大。咁當然就第三次係直情不能入境啦。另外，郭鳳儀 Anna Kwok 佢另外佢分享就係一個比較個人嘅分享。咁佢講到就係佢諗翻過去5年香港喪失言論自由嘅過程係點樣？佢話第一步就係出現咗新聞資訊嘅真空，大家唔再知道乜嘢係事實，唔再知道乜嘢係可信啦，冇辦法去求證。去到第二步就係出現咗大家個聲音開始變得收細咗。佢嘅形容就係 vacuum of rhetoric， 即係大家都唔講嘢啦。一般人都唔講嘢，唔係淨係冇新聞。喺呢種咁寧靜嘅環境，呢種即係肅靜嘅環境，令到大家開始係有一種麻木嘅感覺。咁啊，去到最後一個階段，就係頭先講，直情係有個心理上嘅真空嘅感覺，已經唔再知道香港究竟代表啲乜嘢，香港究竟同佢哋同我哋嘅關係係點樣？咁佢話喺5年之間呢，見到一個咁大嘅轉變啦。咁其中一個佢好具體嘅例子就係有啲5年來可能冇接觸過外邊嘅香港人，咁啊一遇到好似佢咁樣嘅，即係仍然繼續為香港自由民主去奮鬥嘅人，係佢哋會覺得好詫異、好驚訝，即係喺香港出嚟嗰啲人會覺得吓，乜原來外邊仲有人講緊呢啲嘢㗎？喺香港完全唔知道，喺香港已經變咗一個好麻木嘅狀態。咁啊〜呢個亦都延伸到今日嘅另外一個討論呢，就係白奧蘭頭先講到，即係佢哋有一路跟進唔同嘅尤其是同媒體嘅人被檢控相關嘅案件啦。除咗蘋果案，仲有立場案啦嚇。佢有個觀察就係喺一個咁冗長嘅訴訟過程入邊，好容易令到想跟進呢啲案件嘅人都無所適從，冇辦法去跟進。喺冇辦法跟進嘅時候，漸漸就失去咗嗰個關懷，漸漸失去咗個關注。咁啊，佢哋亦都舉咗個例子啦。Anna 亦都提翻就係，其實只係最近歐嘉倫，佢雖然冇俾人檢控，未俾人拉，但係佢原本係有一個喺大學嘅傳理系，原本係有一個課堂，係本來係今個月要開學，但喺開學之前呢，就俾院校通知佢，叫佢唔使教啦。佢話休假啦咁。咁由於歐嘉倫本身亦都同立場案係有一定嘅關係啦，立場案入邊有好多唔同嘅所謂指控嘅文章，其實就同歐嘉倫有關啦，係佢寫啦。所以白奧蘭亦都話擔心佢嚟緊會唔會係會遭受到拘捕。咁除咗講喺香港本地而家仍然身處香港嘅人之外呢，其實佢哋都有討論到離散媒體係喺英國、加拿大、美國、澳洲等地仍然經營緊。咁甚至乎有啲係喺香港可能做，亦都有一定嘅採訪報導嘅媒體。而家個經營狀況，最主 做離散媒體咧，就面對兩個大問題嘅啫。第一就係財政上嘅問題啦。第二就係其實好多離散媒體嘅記者咧，佢哋可能身份上咧仍然未攞到一個永久嘅身份，所以佢哋要喺唔同嘅地方遊走。可能有啲人就先過咗台灣，但係台灣原來係不能夠俾佢哋有個永久居留，所以佢哋又要去英國要去其他地方。咁喺呢個情況之下呢，係令到佢哋無論喺人手抑或財政，都有一個更大嘅挑戰，更大嘅難題。咁喺呢一個資訊唔流通被阻塞咗嘅情況之下呢，咁郭鳳儀 Anna 呢，佢亦都提醒大家咧，當我哋冇可以獲取資訊嘅渠道嘅時候呢，另外一邊廂咧，香港政府就係用緊佢哋喺海外嘅哨站，即係例如經貿辦等，係進行緊資訊戰去各大媒體投稿，去講佢哋嘅説好佢哋嘅香港故事講佢哋版本嘅事，但係其他人就冇咗個平台去講。咁所以佢就大家都去到有個討論，就係關於香港經貿辦呢一個認證法案啦。剛剛就過咗眾議院，咁嚟緊呢係需要經過參議院嘅通過。喺未來呢有4個月時間，如果呢4個月時間不能通過呢，咁法案就要重新嚟過。咁所以其實 Anna 等人呢，佢哋就話佢哋喺嚟緊嘅日子呢，就將會盡力去推動。喺未來4個月，希望能夠令到呢一條法案通過。咁去到最後就有一個討論呢，就係3位講者都講，究竟而家係咪喺中國大陸入邊，比起喺香港更加自由？大家似乎都有一個共識，就係話，因為喺中國大陸入邊境內嗰班可能係公民記者又好，或者係做唔同倡議嘅人又好，佢哋經過好長時間嘅一個磨練咧，大概就知道有關當局嘅底線喺邊。咁所以亦都係因為呢個原因呢，就令到佢哋係好自自然然咁懂得去拿捏揣摩嗰條紅線嘅位置。另外，白奧蘭有講啦，佢話即係根據佢哋得到可靠消息，就係喺香港總共有2000個國安警啦。咁佢話有2000個國安警，究竟佢哋會做啲乜呢？佢哋有咩責任呢？佢哋會唔會揾嘢嚟做呢？咁亦都係因為呢個原因啦嚇，咁所以就可以引申到大家去評估一下，究竟香港嘅狀況係咪比起中國大陸入邊更差？我再講翻今朝早較早時段幾個開始嘅發言嘉賓，佢哋所講過嘅重點內容啦。Jeff Merkley 啦，即係麥克利就係第一位發言嘅嘉賓啦。咁佢其實係而家國會同當局中國委員會嘅聯席主席。咁佢一開始嘅時候呢，佢發言到就有提到，就係香港而家總共仍然有1800個政治犯係被囚禁，而且佢哋係好多時都根本係未有一個合理嘅法律程序去對佢哋作出檢控，即係其實係一個無了期嘅拘留，但係一個冗長嘅法律程序。其實我哋見到今日唔同嘅嘉賓都有提到，就係喺檢控嘅過程或者喺司法嘅過程咧，其實都有帶嚟好多即係違反咗人權自由嘅地方。 咁啊，第二個開始嘅時候分享嘅嘉賓啦 ，Jim McGavin 啦，即係麥嘉文咧，佢其實亦都係講翻，就係佢作為一個美國嘅議員，點解要關注香港嘅事務？咁香港除咗有一個象徵意義之外，更重要嘅一點就係、其實世界各國已經見到中共對外嘅一啲長臂管轄嘅。咁啊，最後就係第三個發言嘅嘉賓呢，就係Young Kim啦。佢其實最主要佢有提到嘅就係話，佢作為呢個外交事務委員會國家安全嘅其中一個小組委員，佢會努力去推動一個兩黨嘅法案，希望能夠達到共識，就係要對於所有同國安法以及23條嘅通過以及立法呢有關嘅相關官員嘅。咁而家我哋睇翻會場啦，我哋將會開始呢，就係第二個環節。第二個環節將會討論嘅內容呢，就係講呢個北京點樣去借香港去進行制裁嘅規避。咁啊喺個 panel 上邊呢，有 Samuel Beckett 啦，佢係之前有為呢個香港自由委員會撰寫報告嘅一個作者啦。另外就係有德基啦，佢就係Razum Ukraine 嘅一個代表嚟嘅。咁而呢一個環節嘅moderator 咧 ，Caroline Bartholomew 咧，其實就係以前Pelosi 嘅前幕僚長嚟嘅。
And I would highly recommend folks to stay after the events. We'll have lunch and networking at the end of the programs for you to mingle and continue those amazing, exciting conversations. And before we go to our next panel, our media team actually reminded me this. Please follow us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. If you haven't done so, it's at the CFHK. At the CFHK. And if you want to post about this event, the Hong Kong Symposium, feel free to use the hashtag HKSymposium24. And we want to make sure that we can drive some momentum on social media and put the attention back to Hong Kong for a bit. So now we'll start our second panel on Hong Kong's central role in sanctions evasions for Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Hong Kong has until recently been considered a top-tier global financial center. Its influence rivaled only by New York and London. Today, Beijing is using Hong Kong as a central hub to facilitate the transfer of money and restricted technology to Russia, Iran, and North Korea, in contravention of US and international sanctions and export controls. Efforts to crack down on sanctions evasions in Hong Kong has proved inadequate. Therefore, a new policy approach is necessary to ensure the world's most brutal regimes are not able to use Hong Kong to gain the tools and resources to threaten global security and stability. Today, we will hear from two experts on this subject to find out how the U.S. can adapt its policy to address this issue. There are Sam Beckett, the convener of the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Roundtable and the author of CFHK's recent report, Beneath the Harbor, which is available at the back of this room for our audience to take home, and Doug Klein, the policy analyst at Razum for Ukraine. Moderating this panel is Caroline Bartholomew, a China policy analyst who has served as a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission for 2 decades, actually. She currently serves as chairman of the board of Radio Free Asia and an advisor to the board of the CFHK Foundation. We're really lucky to have you. And please welcome our speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to CFHK. I really want to acknowledge the work of Sam and others at CFHK in putting this report together. I think it's an important, groundbreaking piece of work as the U.S. is working with our allies in Europe and in Asia and elsewhere in the world to support Ukraine. It's really important for us to understand that there are ways that the Russian military is getting access to things that it is using to attack Ukraine, and they are using Hong Kong. North Korea is using Hong Kong, Russia is using Hong Kong, and Iran is using Hong Kong as a way to get access to technology that is endangering people in Ukraine, but it's also endangering people elsewhere in the world. And I think that this is a very important piece of research and a report that lays out the case. I'll briefly introduce, I think people have access to the bios, so I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists. But before that, a couple of points that I wanted to make. One is, right, it's simple and cheap to open a Hong Kong-based company, and firms in the territory can buy goods produced by U.S. companies with little trouble. Once in Hong Kong, those goods can be shipped with no questions asked to countries and companies under Western sanctions and trade controls. Hong Kong's role in helping Russia continue its assault against Ukraine is startling in its growth and extent. Many of the shipments consist of goods purportedly made by Western companies such as Intel, Analog Devices, Apple, and Texas Instruments. Hong Kong companies have shipped billions of dollars of goods to Russia for its war effort. Analysis of data from August to December 2023 alone showed that $750 million of the total $2 billion in Hong Kong shipments to Moscow comprised goods on the US and EU's list of common high-priority items, which are the advanced components most sought by Russia for its war effort. Companies based in Hong Kong are facilitating Iran and North Korea's efforts to trade in military technology, as well as oil and other natural resources. Every day that we get up now, we can see the impact of Russians expanding attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. They've moved beyond attacking energy infrastructure to hospitals, schools, shopping malls, residential areas. Many of those actions, of course, are war crimes. I read yesterday that 1 of every 7 educational institutions in Ukraine has now either been destroyed or damaged by Russia. For a cost of repairing that's going to be $14 billion, and these attacks are continuing. So there are consequences for what Hong Kong is doing, serving as a transshipment point and serving as a way to, frankly, launder money through in order to facilitate this trade. On that note, I will turn it over to our panelists who have the expertise on all of these. Sam Bickett, as Francis mentioned, is a lawyer, and he's the head of the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Roundtable. He's based now here in Washington, D.C., but he lived in Hong Kong for a number of years. The convener of the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Roundtable, which is a collaboration forum for Hong Kong advocacy organizations. He lived in Hong Kong and Taiwan, where he worked as a corporate sanctions and corruption lawyer from 2013 to 2022. He supported Hong Kong's 2019 anti-extradition movement and was imprisoned twice on false charges before being expelled by the Hong Kong government. And we're honored to have today also Doug Klain, who's a policy analyst for Razom for Ukraine, which is a nonprofit humanitarian aid and advocacy organization. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. His research focuses include U.S. support for Ukraine, Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration, Russia's war on Ukraine, and authoritarianism in Russia. With that, I'll turn it over to Sam to make a brief presentation, and then to Doug, and then we'll move on to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate all of you. I know I see a lot of faces in the crowd of people who are advocates for Hong Kong, who do it as your full-time job, or are partners, and we really are grateful for everything that you do. So, Carolyn got into some of the eye-popping statistics about Hong Kong's role in sort of supplying rogue regimes. So I'm not going to get into that, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, what this is a report about bad people who run bad companies in Hong Kong that are trying to turn a profit, destabilizing the world and funding wars in Ukraine and elsewhere. We really focused in this report on Hong Kong's role as a central hub in supplying goods, oil, money to Russia, to North Korea, and to Iran. And as everyone knows, they're all connected to each other as well. We traced components for missiles that a man named Li Jianwang, based out of Shenzhen, we tracked him down to his home in Shenzhen. He was running a company out of Hong Kong. He was then shipping components for missiles and drones to Iran. Iran was then compiling those drones and then shipping them to Russia. And then they're leading to people being killed in Ukraine. We traced a vessel called the New Conch. This is a vessel that's been floating around the Pacific for years now. Everyone knows it's there. It turns off its transponders, and it's managed and owned out of Hong Kong. It and a number of other vessels will ship oil and other goods to and from North Korea and China. And China knows it's happening. Hong Kong knows it's happening. The UN publishes satellite photos of this Hong Kong-owned vessel in North Korean ports, and nobody is able to stop it. And then we've got connections to the rest of the world that nobody seems to be able to crack down on. A company called Pyroclinos, which has a great website. It's a Hong Kong company that advertises itself as a fertilizer and charcoal company. We, thanks to our data partners at C4ADS here in DC, had access to a huge amount of Russian customs data that showed that this fertilizer company was shipping weapon, drone parts, communications equipment to a sanctioned Russian military supplier called VMK. And how did we find that out? Just from the customs data. But when you look at who Pyroclinos' owners are, they're front companies. They're run out of Cyprus, a European Union member. So you have people who are functionaries who run these companies, who hide their ultimate origins in Russia, who hide their ultimate origins in China. And to this day, every company, every person that I've mentioned so far is still running free, is not been cracked down on, and there's a lot of problems here. And I think we're going to talk more about some of the policy changes that are desperately needed in the United States and the European Union. But fundamentally, I'll just say right now, we've got to speed up how quickly we're finding these companies, sanctioning them, getting them cut off from the global financial system. That's priority number one, and we're really going to be working on that in the coming months.
Thank you all very much for having me here today. This is a very important discussion, and I'm glad that we are able to bring Ukraine into this. Fundamentally, if you care about the fight for freedom in Ukraine, you care about the fight for freedom in Hong Kong. And this report is an excellent reminder of just how deeply linked these issues, these countries, these places are. And so I do want to be clear at the beginning, I am not a sanctions guru. That's you. I work on Russia, Ukraine, the war, and the U.S. role in it. I really want to say good things about your report because it is a remarkable work. And if anybody has not gone back and grabbed a copy yet, please grab it, follow along, take it back to your office with you. I think a good place that I would like to start, and maybe we can turn back to this later, but Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell this week acknowledged that China is giving Russia, quote, very substantial help in its war to destroy Ukraine. And Russia is paying China back with high-level military technologies on submarines and missiles, and both governments are trying to hide these efforts. And what Sam has done in this report is kind of pull the curtain back on these efforts, on what is happening, on what China, via Hong Kong, is doing to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is deeply linked. And the report also goes on to show how Hong Kong is being used to aid Iran and North Korea in skirting U.S. sanctions. Again, I'm very glad that that is included because it goes on to show both of these countries have also provided missiles and weapons to Russia for its war. It goes on to show that this is a connected issue, that these countries are working together on this. So I do want to take a moment at the start of this discussion because we're talking about sanctions and critical components, and it can get very technical very quickly. But I want to take a minute and just remind folks what we are actually talking about. And we are talking about this. And if you can see it, this is a piece of shrapnel from a Russian Iskander-K 9M727 cruise missile. So my team at Razum for Ukraine brought this back from Ukraine about a year ago. This piece of shrapnel comes from a missile that is about the size of a truck. It was hurled at civilians in Kharkiv. It destroyed a civilian storage facility, a warehouse. Miraculously, it did not kill anybody. That is the exception to the rule. Russia has fired over 10,000 missiles like this since the start of the full-scale invasion, thousands of Iranian-made suicide drones. And the reason why I bring this thing in particular is because Texas Instruments, which is based in Dallas, produces critical components that are used in this missile. It would not be able to function without the components that come from a company in Texas here in the United States. And that is what we're talking about. Most people tend to know Texas Instruments because it produces the TI-84 calculators. And so that's why I like to bring this thing in particular, because it's familiar. Texas Instruments and many other US and other Western companies, they make the components that are being effectively smuggled through Hong Kong and other places to Russia and into missiles like this. This is how you go from a microchip created by a company in Dallas to a cruise missile that is being hurled at civilians in Kharkiv. This is not a detached academic discussion. This is a very serious discussion about destroying Putin's war machine. It's about the rule of law, and it's about making sure that authoritarians do not win the day. So I look forward very much to this discussion and to your questions.
Thanks very much, Doug, and I commend you for being able to get that through security here in the U.S. Capitol. But I think it's just an important reminder. I mean, again, this morning as I was looking at the news, there was another attack on some civilian infrastructure in Kharkiv, and you know, people are dying every day. Civilians are dying every day because of what Russia is doing and the technology that it is getting from North Korea, from Iran, and from China. I'm going to go back also to what Doug said about Kurt Campbell. Right, earlier this week, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell finally acknowledged publicly that China is giving Russia very substantial help to strengthen its war machine. He's quoted in a political article as saying, these are component pieces of a very substantial effort on the part of China to help sustain, build, and diversify various elements of the Russian war machine. And then he added, we're seeing efforts at the highest levels of both governments to try to both hide and protect certain elements of this worrisome collaboration. Most of these activities have been driven underground. For those of us who've focused also on China's increased militarization and its military reform, Kurt noted that Russia is transferring to China submarine, missile, and other sensitive technologies. We know that China has struggled to address weaknesses in its submarine and missile programs. So this activity, this ongoing exchange, extends Russia's ability to attack Ukraine, but it also increases China's ability to threaten countries throughout the Indo-Pacific. So for both of our panelists, I'm going to ask, what role does Hong Kong play in these exchanges, and what is the impact on the ground in Ukraine? Sam, you want to start?
The statement from the State Department is definitely concerning. I take it mostly as relating to sort of intellectual property and sort of the information needed to produce some of these things, which would be less related to Hong Kong. What we're seeing in Hong Kong is the actual supply of goods, and I think that is tied into that, I think the new development there, you know, the State Department has been talking about Hong Kong supplying goods to Russia for quite some time, although they've done some things, I'll say diplomatically, but we need them to do a lot more. But where we're really seeing Hong Kong's unique role here compared to other places is in the supply of technology. And this isn't, by the way, what you see in the news a lot about China supplying goods and China supplying Chinese-made and manufactured goods. This is Hong Kong's special role here, is the bulk of goods that we're seeing are U.S. manufactured, Taiwanese manufactured, European Union manufactured goods that are being shipped to Hong Kong, most likely legally, and then Hong Kong is reshipping them to Russia and to Iran in particular. And so where you have China, as Kurt Campbell talked about, China kind of providing a lot of information and technology and intellectual property and things like that now to Russia. What Hong Kong is doing is providing the physical components that are then used to manufacture weaponry.
Can you talk a little bit more about the impact on the ground in Ukraine of this technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, those comments from Deputy Secretary of State Campbell, I mean, it really is a historic thing of the level of support that China is giving to Russia for this invasion, and China's support is critical to Russia's ability to continue the invasion. Russia would not be giving such sensitive technologies, submarines, missiles, and other things that were mentioned. That is a historic thing that Russia is giving that to China, and it would not be doing that if China was not really making a significant contribution to the war effort. And I'm glad that you made the distinction between what China does with domestically produced goods and what Hong Kong does with acting as this conduit for things that should not be going to Russia that are going there. When we talk about trying to break this link that Hong Kong is acting as, or at least slow down the ability of these components to make it to Russia, you can never fully stop the ability of Russia to get its hands on these things. There are so many of them out there, and in many of these missiles that we've seen, some of these components that were produced by Western companies, some were produced before the full-scale invasion, were already outside of the United States, and then found their way to Russia. But there are components that have been produced after the full-scale invasion that have been found in missiles and drones that have landed in Ukraine. And so when we talk about trying to slow that down, the impact on the ground is there are fewer missiles and drones flying at Ukrainian civilians. Russia relies on numbers to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. They have gotten very sophisticated in their air attacks on Ukraine, where they will send multiple missiles of different types along with these suicide drones, and they will take different circuitous paths to confuse and overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. And the more of these missiles and drones that they can put in each attack, the more overwhelmed Ukrainian air defenses can be, and the more things that can get through. If 100 missiles are flying at Kyiv, if you can take that number from 100 down to even 80 or 70, those are fewer interceptors, ammunition that is needed for Ukraine to shoot them down, and that is more lives that can be saved. It's about slowing this down and breaking that machine.
And I would add to that, it's also about how smart these weapons are. Yeah. I think it's you brought up Texas Instruments, and we bring them up a lot as well. And part of that is because of the sheer volume of Texas Instruments stuff that's making its way to Ukraine through Hong Kong and elsewhere. Ultimately, though, I think what concerns me the most is not Texas Instruments. They make calculators, right? I mean, their chips are fairly reproducible by China and places like that. The most concerning to me are American companies at the cutting edge, like NVIDIA. NVIDIA recently in the New York Times, they asked them for comment on some of their most advanced AI technology getting to China and presumably also getting to Russia. NVIDIA said, well, it's like a speed limit, and we follow the speed limit. The US government sets, if they set a 75 speed limit and we're going 65, then we're fine. These are people dying. I mean, it's violence and really an invasion of Europe, and it's extraordinary things, some of the corporate irresponsibility of some of these companies. But ultimately, it's that real cutting edge stuff that that I think most resources really need to be focused on. You're never going to stop all Texas Instruments and Texas Instruments equivalent sort of low-level chips getting there, but if you can stop the ones that they're using to create AI, to create the most advanced weaponry, the most sort of smart weapons, smart communication systems, then you're making a real cut into what's happening.
Thank you. It's been reported recently that Iran has delivered over 200 short-range ballistic missiles to Russia. The New York Times reported yesterday that the remnants of North Korean short-range ballistic missiles found in Ukraine have been manufactured this year and may have included Western components. Could crackdowns in Hong Kong help to prevent further missile deliveries by Iran and North Korea?
Yes. In our report, we found a number of instances of Hong Kong being the conduit for shipments not just to Russia but also to Iran and to North Korea. As we've seen, Russia quite openly has been building those relationships and using Iranian weaponry in particular, and now building a closer relationship with North Korea. All of these are connected, and ultimately the biggest hub in the world for this activity is Hong Kong. Part of that is the political situation in Hong Kong. Importantly, the government of Hong Kong has openly welcomed these and said we will not enforce these Western sanctions. So they've welcomed these companies to come set up. They've tried to create this environment where it can be a hub for supplying these three regimes and others. Part of that is geography. It's right in the center of Asia. If you look on a map, it's pretty equidistant between Russia and North Korea and Iran. It's a great spot for them to coordinate all these activities. And so if you had a crackdown in Hong Kong on this, it would significantly curtail the flow of these ships. The U.S. government has been pushing hard with more sticks than carrots, threatened for the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government to crack down on this. I think, frankly, it's a little naive. They're not going to do that, and we're seeing that in the newest statements from Kurt Campbell as well. The only way to crack down on what's happening in Hong Kong is to cut off the finance, so sanction the banks that are financing trade finance, cut off the logistics companies, sanction those companies so they're cut off. And so far, the U.S. government, the EU have not done that. So you're not going to get the Hong Kong government to do this, but you can hit where it hurts.
Doug, anything to add?
Other than agreeing vehemently with everything that you just said, back with the original question of will this actually have an impact? Yes. Russia's ability to produce these kinds of high-powered, complex weapons and machines domestically is actually quite limited. Russia is intensely reliant on foreign goods, on foreign components. The components that we're talking about that go through Hong Kong are things that Russia is very limited in its ability to produce domestically. It has to get them from places like Hong Kong. There are other places, other machines like CNC machine tools, which are very high precision machine cutting tools that help produce things like this missile, like tanks. And again, that's something that is only produced in the West and in China, that Russia cannot make itself. We have an ability to crack down on Russia's ability to get these things. It gets CNC machines from Taiwan, and that is something where the United States does have leverage. If we choose to use it, we can limit the flow of these kinds of high-powered goods to Russia.
So you both have sort of mentioned some things that we could do, but given particularly that we're here at the Capitol, what can the U.S. Congress do to encourage the administration to take more action on some of these things?
Yeah, so we've been developing some advocacy areas in our advocacy, some sort of areas where, in particular, the U.S. Congress are hoping will act. There's a couple that are fairly straightforward, and we think we're going to see, hopefully, legislation on this introduced fairly soon. One is sanction the banks. The U.S., the administration has so far failed to do that. They keep threatening to do that. It's a little bizarre sometimes how much they sort of trip over their words and saying, well, we're going to do that, we're going to do that, we're threatening to do that, and they put it into press releases, and that's great. But at a certain point, they have to do it. And now we think they're not going to, so we'd like to see legislation introduced that essentially would require the administration to make a determination on particular Hong Kong banks involved in trade finance. Without getting too much into the weeds, you can't do international trade without trade finance. You can't do it in cash. It has to be done with debt. And to do it with debt, you need a bank. So if you cut off the banks, then you make a huge difference here. And really, you don't have to sanction Bank of China. You don't have to sanction China Construction Bank or HSBC. If you sanction, I say this as someone who was a corporate sanctions lawyer advising some of these foreign banks for a long time. If you sanction one little bank, one little trade finance bank in Hong Kong, in China, every other bank will get in line. And that includes Bank of China. I don't care what the Chinese government says about, oh, you can't enforce US sanctions. Bank of China enforces US sanctions if they think they're going to get hit with something. Everyone does, because every bank in the world needs, well, I wouldn't say every, most banks in the world, every big bank in the world needs access to the US financial system, because 55% of trade in the world is conducted in US dollars. They're not going to mess that up. So sanction the banks. Number two, we are really pressing for Hong Kong as a jurisdiction to be designated as what's called a primary money laundering concern. And we're hoping for legislation on this as well. The Treasury Department has the power to do this on their own, but legislation may be the best approach to it. A primary money laundering concern, it's something less than sanctions, but what it basically does is it allows the US government to require US banks to get information about who they're trading with in Hong Kong and who's ultimately benefiting from that trade. It's a bit of a technical issue, but sanctions, US sanctions, are so impactful because, as I said before, so much of the world's trade is done in US dollars. The way that works functionally is that if you're doing some trade between Angola and Indonesia, you're doing it in US dollars. That means your Indonesian bank then needs to go to what's called a US correspondent bank, which is in the United States, to then trade that money. So what the primary money laundering concern designation would require, or could require, is that US bank then has to go to the Indonesian bank and say, no, who is your client? Who are you actually doing work for? And we need to get diligence on those people, and we need to look at them and understand exactly what they're trading in. And that's, again, it's pretty technical. I don't want to get into the weeds, but it would make a huge difference in the ability to finance some of this stuff. It's also a pretty significant ask. It would really, really make the Chinese government pretty angry. But China, if you think about just the words, a primary money laundering concern, that's literally squarely what Hong Kong is now. Kind of always has been, but more so now. Right, so it's a very fitting thing to put in place. And I'll just mention third, this is a lot more complex and it's a lot broader than China, but we have got to get legislation to get more resources to the agencies in the United States that are responsible for investigating and designating and enforcing both sanctions and export controls, what's called the entity list. So in particular, that's the Bureau of Industry and Security, it's the Office of Foreign Assets Control, it's the State Department, and it's the Department of Justice. We've been in contact with a lot of people over there, engaged with them, and unanimously there's just agreement that there's not enough people, there's not enough technology. Sometimes they're working on systems that are 10, 15, 20 years old. Imagine that you're trying to track some of these really sophisticated parties on Windows XP, right? It's not going to go really well. So that's essential, and I won't get too much into the weeds of that, but there's a lot of ideas out there about, if the money is there, where it should go, and how it can really shorten the period. And some of the things we're looking at, I think the typical period between first starting to investigate a company and designating it for sanctions is about 8 to 12 months. In Hong Kong, it takes 3 or 4 days to dissolve a company and create a new one. So we're not really doing much.
I want to just underline that last point that you made on funding the agencies responsible, BIS, OFAC you mentioned, that is something that Congress can absolutely and can and should do. The United States passed historic sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. But we did not get the appropriations to actually enforce all of these sanctions. It's within our power to do it. We just have to choose to do it. So I really want to underline that. If these agencies should be funded, they need the people and the resources to enforce the sanctions that we have passed. I also just want to add on the corporate responsibility issue. You talk a lot in the report about, and you mentioned here, some of these companies will follow the speed limit. They are acting within the confines of the law to the best of their knowledge. They don't know who the end user is sometimes, but there absolutely can and should be better corporate due diligence requirements and better responsibility. We know that these components are making their way into sanctioned entities, making their way into weapons that are landing in Ukraine. There is more that these companies can do about it, and it should be very politically harmful to their reputation to not be taking this action. There should be far more scrutiny on them.
These are all really good ideas. I will make a pitch that the China Commission last year, one of our recommendations was essentially about rationalizing and streamlining all of our different entity lists, because there are multiple lists with multiple U.S. government agencies involved, and it's a complicated thing for companies that even do want to comply.
I want to touch on that because this is a big thing, guys. Traditionally we had OFAC issues sanctions, right? We now have BIS issuing, essentially acting as a sanctioning organization. These are guys that until about 10 years ago, they dealt with stuff coming into the United States through customs and going back out. They're now suddenly thrust into sanctions. They have 3 people who are responsible for investigating this. Everything is a patchwork right now. And you talk about the difference between, funding something through Congress, which is, John Stivers over here, who's our sort of veteran on this stuff. Every time we talk about legislation about funding something, his eyes get really big and he starts looking shifty. But, it is really hard to get things funded. But you can at least, rethink and reorganize without necessarily adding new funding, how these things are being streamlined. One thing we don't want to do, and this is something that we considered earlier and have had a lot of conversations, one thing we don't want to do is add new layers of approval. We don't want to centralize this in a way where then you've got suddenly the Department of Homeland Security now which doesn't really deal with this stuff, has to approve everything. That's something we don't want. We can look at something instead that's potentially a 30-day no objection to potential sanctions designations to make sure everybody can have their say. But we want to streamline. We don't want to sort of overdo it, but we need to coordinate better.
Since you mentioned John and I both did appropriations on the Hill. The reality is the money is there when people choose to make it a priority. That's the challenge, is to make these things a priority. I have a couple of other questions.
Support political prisoners in China. This is the second time for me to talking about this sanction evasion by Hong Kong. Looks like Sam and this gentleman Rosen all have good, very determination, the idea regarding what to do. But what's the difficulty right now? The things are not done yet. Because compared to last time, we already over a month passed. What's the progress, or say how we can remove the difficulty to do this kind of stop the bank, stop the action you proposed?
Yeah, so I mean, if the question is sort of since the last event we had on this, there has been progress. So we can't say much, but there is certain legislation coming. And we think that will be well received. It's not everything that we are asking for. It's a long process. Everything is, and we're about to have an election, so we know how that works, right? But there is you'll see news, I think, before too long of certain legislation that at least is going to be the start of this. Certainly not the end. And I know these guys at Rosam are working on some things more broadly as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in addition to the problem of resources and capacity of the administration to enforce sanctions, on key issues, there are problems of political will for the administration to take action on things. This is distinct from what we're talking about here, but related. It took over 2 years after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine for the Biden administration to put out a business advisory for Russia, to put out an official advisory to U.S. companies that if you do business in Russia, you are at risk of violating sanctions, you are funding through taxes the Russian war effort, and you will be coerced into helping mobilize employees for the Russian government for the war. And it took over 2 years after the full-scale invasion for that to be done, and we had to push quite hard for it to happen. And so some of these issues are of capacity, but there are political will issues.
Mike?
Mike Gonzalez of the Heritage Foundation. Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. So we know that that Iran is providing missiles and drones to these militias across the Middle East, and we know that a lot of those components that they're using to build those are coming from Hong Kong, and not exclusively. They produce some of their own. They get them from elsewhere, but there have been multiple cases. There's a great organization out of the UK called RUSI that has examined some of these missiles and things that have shown up in the Middle East, and they have Texas Instruments parts in them. They have parts from Japan. They have parts from Taiwan. So this is absolutely happening. Hong Kong is a big provider of that.
Sheridan?
Hi, I'm Sheridan Prasso from Bloomberg. I guess a few months ago over the summer, for the first time, the BIS put some of the corporate secretarial services and also specific addresses in Hong Kong on the entities list for the first time. Do we have any idea of what the impact of that has been? Has everybody just closed up that room 305 and moved it to room 307? Or is there any actual impact from it that we can see?
So first of all, Sherry is going to be modest, but she's also done incredible work in this specific area. And Bloomberg, before we even started working on any of this, she worked on a piece that exposed some of these Hong Kong companies that were doing sanctions evasion. So thank you for your work on it, and really in many ways kind of drawing our attention to some of it as well. So what she's talking about here is that BIS has been looking for ways to deal with the problem that they sanction, or you add a company to the entity list, and then they dissolve the company, and then they start a new one the next day. The guy I mentioned earlier, Li Jianwang, he got sanctioned. His company got sanctioned. His company Artronix last year. 2 days later, he filed to dissolve it. Now he's running a new company called ETS International. ETS International is not on any sanctions list. So, it was really, really easy to do. One thing that BIS has tried to do to change that, and let me say, BIS, I think, is working under some pretty strict political restrictions. BIS wants to do a lot, and we know that, and they have limitations on what they can do. But one thing is they've started adding addresses. This is the first time they've ever done this, so they added addresses in Hong Kong to the entity list. What are these addresses? They're corporate services companies. So if you look at the corporate documents for ETS International, the official corporate address will be some random address in Wan Chai in Hong Kong. Reporters will then go to Wan Chai to that address, and they find an empty office with some boxes, maybe a secretary, maybe not, but really then you'll have dozens or hundreds of companies that are set up that way. This is not exclusive to Hong Kong. You go to Delaware, you'll find the same thing, right? As you've just got these companies where your official address is just some random corporate services company in Delaware. So what BIS is doing is tracking down the worst offenders of those on providing corporate services to companies exporting to Russia. And then they're sanctioning the address itself, since a lot of these corporate services companies have different entities at that address and things like that. The question ultimately is how much effect does that have when you can change your address from 305 to 307? I would say I'm very skeptical. It creates a little bit of a problem for them, a little bit of annoyance. I don't think that it has as much of an effect as we would like it to, but I am glad to see BIS trying to get creative on hitting some of these support companies. companies. We'd like to see them not just hit the corporate services companies, but the support companies that are providing logistics. There's one called CorpLink International that's got a niche of shipping these things for other companies back and forth. We'd like to see more targets like that. And again, the banks, very easy. It creates a bit of an impact, but it's going to have a lot more effect than sanctioning addresses.
We only have a couple minutes left, but I'm actually going to ask another question. Take the prerogative of the chair, Grace, and that is, how much of all of this is Beijing aware of, and do they have any incentive to try to crack down on any of this?
I mean, they're definitely aware of it, because if nothing, I mean, they would be aware of it anyway. But if nothing else, the U.S. government keeps sending people over there and yelling at them about it. And having high-level meetings to try and persuade them, again, I think fairly unrealistically, to not do it. They will have incentives to crack down on this if the United States puts its money where its mouth is and starts sanctioning their banks. They will have incentive to do it if we get legislation introduced to potentially designate Hong Kong as a primary money laundering concern. These are things that Hong Kong cares about, and they're things that Beijing definitely cares about. And yeah, they'll scream and shout about it, and they'll release angry statements, but they'll do it at the end of the day. They'll do it quietly, but they'll do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, going after the banks is really key, I think, to creating incentives for cooperating, or at least for downgrading the level of cooperation that China has with Russia on this. Going after the money is very key to creating those incentives. And yes, of course, they are aware of it. Russia would not be giving them missiles and submarine technology for submarines and missiles and other things if they were not aware of what they were doing.
Thank you. I think it's been a real honor to actually have such expertise on this panel, and I appreciate it. And just want to remind people that there are very real consequences for all of this that's taking place. Again, I think every day of the people in Ukraine who are suffering under this Russian onslaught. We think of this increasing alliance between Russia, North Korea, Iran. It's a real trouble in the world as this is taking place. So, I mean, there are things that need to be done in order to address this, to improve lives of people in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. So, thank you both for the work that you're doing. Thank you to the audience for your interest in all of this. Thank you to CFHK for this report, and we look forward to hearing more about it. Thanks.
Thank you.
剛才就係第二節嘅討論啦。咁第二節嘅討論呢，主要就係講香港點樣被利用為規避各種制裁嘅一個地方。咁啊，最主要梗係講俄羅斯啦。咁但係同時之間都有涉及到伊朗同埋北韓嘅。咁入邊其中一個重要嘅信息就係，如果要有效地去令到香港正面咁樣去對應呢個制裁問題，當然最直接嘅就係將部分已經查明係有協助呢啲洗黑錢活動嘅銀行呢，係直接制裁，因為咁樣呢就會令到所有銀行呢都會警惕啦。但係就算唔係以制裁形式咧 ，Sam Beckett 都提出咧，就係可以將香港列為一個primary money laundering concern 嘅 destination。咁啊，簡單直譯就係一個主要嘅洗黑錢嘅需要關注嘅地方。因為一旦有咗呢一個咁嘅標籤之後咧，所有美國銀行要同香港嘅銀行有任何交易咧，有任何交收咧，都必然咧係會涉及到一個更加謹慎啲嘅步驟，即係例如你嘅對方銀行究竟嗰啲錢係入落咩公司度，嗰啲公司嘅底細係啲乜嘢嘢，最終係佢嘅 beneficiary 係邊個等等咧，都係要清楚交代嘅。咁啊，去到最後即係基本上呢個就係針對銀行係能夠令到香港冇咁容易變成呢一個咁樣嘅規避制裁中心嘅。好啦，咁啊，我哋而家睇下第三個 環節啦。
It's based within China's national strategy and Beijing's military civil fusion policy. For decades, the PRC has benefited from Hong Kong's role as an international financial center and a source of rule of law for mainland Chinese companies. Over the past several years, Hong Kong has become more fully integrated into the Greater Bay Area region and stepped up its investments in emerging technologies as part of a national strategy. Here today, we're going to talk about the risk this presents to the world, international security in the United States. So thanks so much. We have, to my left here, Peter Mattis, president of the Jamestown Foundation and an adjunct lecturer at the Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service. Most recently, Mr. Mattis was senior fellow with the U.S. House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the U.S. and the CCP, and he was on loan from the Special Competitive Studies Project, where he served as Director for Intelligence from 2021 to 2023. From 2019 to 2021, he served as the Senate-appointed staff director for the CECC, where he was a part of the legislative team that passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, Tibetan Policy and Support Act, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Mattis is the author of Analyzing the Chinese Military, a review essay and resource guide on the People's Liberation Army, and a co-author of Chinese Communist Espionage and Intelligence Primer. Rick Switzer is founder and principal of Project X, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Technology Consulting. He was previously the Director of Policy and Strategy Special Envoy Office for Critical and Emerging Technology at the U.S. State Department. During Rick's 20-year career as a member of the Foreign Service, he served as the State Department visiting professor at the National Intelligence University, teaching graduate courses on China's economy and innovation system, as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Council, and a senior State Department advisor to the Defense Department, working with the Air Force and the Army. Other highlights include serving as the Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and he spent a year also as a senior fellow at the Special Competitive Studies Project. And prior to joining government, Rick founded a wireless technology startup. So I'm really excited to speak with you both today about these important topics. And I'll start first with you, Rick. Hong Kong has always been a bridge between the mainland and the rest of the world. And you have said previously that what many people describe as China's opening up period in the 1980s was really about the world opening up for China rather than China opening up to the world. What did you mean by that? And where has Hong Kong fit in with China's economic and technological development for the last few decades?
Oh, thank you very much. I like to say that. I think it's sort of, it shouldn't be provocative actually, but sometimes it is for some strange reason. Gaiga Kaifang was reform and opening up, but if you look at China and the number of foreigners who are interacting with China between about 1959, 1960, when they kicked out the Soviet advisors, and quite literally until about 1966, 1977, there were only a few hundred foreigners residing in China in any capacity whatsoever. And so then you sort of fast forward with the whole idea of reform and opening up, and it was structured in a way primarily to send Chinese students out to bring information back. And then Hong Kong played a very specific and critical role. Hong Kong was the doorway through which most foreigners entered China for at least the first 15 years of reform and opening up. Very small numbers of folks, foreigners, were on the ground living in places, maybe Beijing or Shanghai. But once you got to a second and third tier city, or even other first tier cities, almost nobody. And so that role that Hong Kong played in being the conduit through which capital, talent, technology, and then market access, understanding how to leverage global markets, that was all done by Hong Kong bankers, actually. So if you look at even today, you have the red chips, or even if you look at listed companies, for instance, Tencent or any of these guys are listed on the NASDAQ, they all actually funnel through the Hong Kong banks into holding companies in the Caribbean. So that's the role it continued to play for quite a long time. But then if you look at the sort of opening up to the world to China and not the other way around, markets were closed It was very difficult to move and to live there. There was a very small period of time we were just talking about, maybe between about 1997 and perhaps 2005 or 2000, maybe as late as 2008, where the world, I think, was fooled, right? And there was somewhat permissive, and there were growing numbers of foreigners sort of teaching and living and even starting businesses in ways that had never really happened in China's history. Right? There was an interim period in the Republic, maybe, or in Shanghai and a few places, but the broad scope of foreigners moving into small towns, teaching at high schools, was really an aberration. And then you begin to see this retrenchment back to less and less. And so today, for instance, or at least the latest census, I think it's the 2022 census, there are only about 900,000 permanent foreign residents in China. Let that kind of sink in. This is 1.3 billion people, right? This is the country that conducts more trade and more academic exchanges than any other country in the world, quite literally. They have consulates and embassies all over the world, but yet they only have less than 1 million permanent residents. And the United States has orders of magnitude, 18% of Americans are born elsewhere. That's citizens, right, let alone. So, we have millions and millions of lawful permanent residents and obviously tens of millions are not. And every year, millions are transitioning from permanent resident status to citizen status, right? Whereas in the PRC, obtaining citizenship is almost impossible. It's virtually unheard of. And so you still have this world today, and it's getting smaller and smaller, and COVID supercharged this, but this is by no means because of COVID. They were already beginning to close down access of foreigners to do business, to live, to stay. There was, again, this really small window where it seemed like it was a great place to be and people wanted to be there. But those numbers have shrunk down to the point, I would argue, and we could argue the numbers, 90% or more of PRC citizens have never had a conversation with a foreigner in their entire life, have never actually met a foreigner. The only thing they know about people who are not from the PRC, they learn from the government, and they learn from a controlled media. So this is why you get these really sort of jaundiced views of foreigners. This is why when you're kind of on the Weibo and the other sort of channels, you see these very jingoistic folks. And it's literally because nobody knows, nobody has met, nobody spent any appreciable time with any foreigners. They don't speak English. Maybe they watch dubbed movies here and there, but they don't really know. All they know is this sort of tiny window. But yet, China has increased its trade, increased its investment, it's increased its scientific cooperation to the point where every major university in the United States, until very recently, and all of them still do, were expanding their research cooperation with Chinese entities, right? Every major European research institute was expanding their research cooperation. But if you look closely at it, and there's been several good studies, most of that is about bringing knowledge into China. Sometimes knowledge is developed in China that is done jointly with foreigners and it sort of goes out, but the new scientific data law has made that really, really hard to come out. And so the whole process has been bring talent, capital, technology in, and Hong Kong played a very important role there. I think I'll let Peter speak.
Peter, where does Hong Kong fit within the CCP's ideology and China's national strategy?
I think over the long term, we have to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is, as a Leninist party that's about mobilizing people, it has to have a goal. It's sink or swim, pursuing that objective. And it's been pretty consistent. Well, it's been entirely consistent from Mao Zedong forward, and even some of the earlier revolutionaries in China, who are trying to achieve something that's now called the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And I think you can say that there are a few key components of that vision of rejuvenation. The first one is a kind of comprehensive modernity that's about making the country militarily powerful, politically cohesive, having sustainable economic growth, ensuring that the party is in charge but is capable of governing and not being corrupted by these connections to the outside world. The second one is building China's comprehensive national power to be essentially as a world leader, sufficient to redefine global governance and win respect for China's political system. And in some cases, simply redefine the way international relations and international institutions function and work. I think you can put it in a way of projecting the way the party governs inside China and sort of governs different social groups and parts of society, but elevating that to the international system so that international relations run through Beijing rather than running through United Nations or having kind of the liberal bias that many of these institutions have, right, which they have for good reason. The final one, and this is where you really get to the core of Hong Kong, is national unification. And the party likes to claim reunification, but I think in most of these cases it's unification at this point. That we thought of this as being political control, that, oh, if Hong Kong and Macau are returned to PRC control, then they'll follow through on the agreement, they'll honor the treaty commitments, and there will be 50 years of autonomous kind of rule, respect for how Hong Kong chooses to evolve. But I think what we've learned, and has been incredibly visible, is that it's also about economic, social, and cultural unification, right? Tongyi in Chinese is not just a physical thing, but is also kind of an ideational piece, right? And when you look at the periphery of the PRC, that's where you see the biggest differences between sort of the party-approved version of Han Chinese culture, right, between Uyghurs with Tibetans. But we should remember there were language riots 15 years ago in Guangdong province over language policy, right? And that was because Cantonese was a language that was used on the street, it was used in government buildings, and the party wanted to change that. And so for a place like Hong Kong, it is a question that the party is trying to figure out, how do we keep this open world that Rick talked about, but bring Hong Kong sort of closer and closer and integrated much more to unify it, shall we say, economically with the PRC, to make it socially and culturally a part of the PRC rather than its own kind of entity. I think for those of you who remember the Hong Kong intellectual scene of the 1970s and early 1980s, there's a very self-conscious effort to create a Hong Kong identity, to say that, no, there is actually a Hong Kong style of Cantonese. There's a Hong Kong way of expressing ourselves. And the party is seeking to undo that conscious effort of Hong Kongers to define themselves and to situate themselves in a place in the world.
If I may, I just want one little point on what Peter mentioned, because I think it's important. Because you see our states interacting deeply with with the PRC, and it's all just directed and driven by the central government. If you go, and I served in the embassy twice and had traveled to all but 4 provinces actually. If you go and you want to have a meeting with anybody, you have to go through what's called the WIBON, right? So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has offices in the provinces and in the cities through which you have to ask permission. Now, it used to be, again, in the late 90s and early 2000s that was sort of a just a perfunctory thing you had to do. But by 2013, 14, it was impossible. They couldn't meet with you. You couldn't go. I taught at Beijing University. I had professor friends who I'd known for over a decade when I came back in 2015. When I wanted to go and have coffee with them on campus, I was told I have to ask permission from the WIBON. And same thing with any province. If you want to go in and talk to a provincial government, they have their WIBON handlers who set the meeting up. They approve you coming in. They approve the talking points, the messages. So you think about this again, opening the world to China, but not China to the world, right? What happens when any Chinese official or state enterprise wants to come in and talk to California or Tennessee or the city of Cleveland, right? There's nobody who knows what's going on. You have amateurs who, quite frankly, running City Hall who are like, oh, of course, let's come on in, let's talk, right? And so there's this huge sort of asymmetry of knowledge, power, influence that happens when they engage at the local level. That what they recognize that asymmetry, and this is why they refuse to let anybody at any level interact with their local officials without the control and the conduit of foreign policy control that is controlled out of Beijing through these satellite offices called the local WIBON. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate what Peter was saying.
Rick, can you put that also within the context of the role Hong Kong plays in Beijing's foreign technology absorption strategy?
Yeah, early on, it was the most important window. Quite literally, there is no modern China without Hong Kong. It is that important. Shenzhen and what Shenzhen and Guangzhou mean for the modern Chinese economy They proved, right, that there were ways to make money. So Beijing Jeep's a good example, right? Beijing Jeep was one of the very first companies to go in. They never made any money. They got their butts kicked, right? They lost money. And they basically, they closed it up and turned tail and left. Where the world sort of discovered how to play this unique role, this special role that Beijing will let you play, was in southern China. And the people who did that were not foreign business people or foreign diplomats who discovered southern China. No, the Hong Kongers knew how to do business there. And the Hong Kong bankers and the Hong Kong consultants were the ones who actually took the foreign businesses and went in and managed the relations. They went in and helped build the factories, right? They did the work of recruiting the kind of people who could be helpful. And then there was almost always a hand-holding. And eventually firms got established, and then you would have an expat sort of leadership team that would come in. But Hong Kong played that incredible role. Well, on the science side as well, right? It's the very first things when the United States, and I was part of this as the Minister Counselor for Environment, Science, Technology, and Health at Embassy Beijing, was the Science Technology Agreement, which we're looking to renew again. We renewed it when I was there, and I was part of that process. And then digging through the old files, I had sort of discovered, and this is all public record, is foilable, the very first document we ever signed with the PRC after we established relationships was the Science Technology Agreement. The Beijing and Deng Xiaoping wanted the STA badly. And we found it difficult to do work. The very first things we did were actually like physics and a few things like that. But the really applied science, which is where China needed the help, they didn't need help in basic energy science. We did that for a number of weird reasons. But the applied science that really drove innovation and built, the firms that eventually become Huawei and ZTE and all these guys, that was done with the cooperation with Hong Kong universities, right? And multinationals endowing chairs and doing work and professor exchanges that happened in Hong Kong. And so those very sort of senior professor type exchanges where you have a professor come for 6 months, that started to happen at Tsinghua and elsewhere, but it's always been sort of difficult. Hong Kong is just a place where it's easier to come in and insinuate yourself into the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology as a returning, Hua Yi or Hua Qiao or as an American, sort of German descent or whatever. That was a place you could come in and do really easy work. It was easier to bring in your sort of students and postdoc fellows who could come in ways that are almost impossible for any number of reasons in the PRC. And so they played a very critical role in building the new technology capacity, right? The science capacity was built by foreign, by students going overseas, right? That was where that was brought, and that was brought back through a number of things like the 1,000 talent programs and all the things that were done with the 863 program and some of the other things that China was working on. But the technology transfer is the ability to make the things that really makes China today, right? The sort of the techno-industrial nation state that in many areas is a peer of the United States and in some areas has actually surpassed the United States. That really funneled through that window. And then the investment, the savvy technology investment, and the ability to bring capital in and out. Again, these are all sort of intertwined, right? You don't think about the U.S. innovation system and just think about the scientists, right? You think about Silicon Valley, you think about the venture capitalists, right? You think about all the other people that go into making something like a Google. Well, all that was learned through that Hong Kong window and continues to this day. Is a very good example, which is Tong Xiao-O, who recently passed away, was a brilliant professor. He even was a U.S. permanent resident. I don't know if he ever actually got citizenship. I know he never got citizenship, but he became a U.S. LPR. He did his PhD at MIT. He was one of the really early brilliant pioneers on AI in the United States. Got hired up by Microsoft, and then he wants to go back to China. Microsoft sends him back to sort of run their operations, at least the sort of technology side of the operations. And he launches this thing called Microsoft Research Asia, which has done more to bring in AI and some leading edge IT, high performance computing technology and disseminate it into China than anywhere else, any other institution by any other foreign entity ever. But then when he finally leaves there, what he decides to do is he goes and he launches an AI PhD program at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And there's a reason why he did that, right? It was a place where he could continue to interact with MIT and his colleagues. He could bring in his colleagues from around the world, have them teach, have them live and participate, and he knew that it was easier. There's a permissiveness, particularly up until very recently. Hong Kong is one of the greatest cities, and folks have us who spent time there, in the 90s and 2000s, and folks who are lucky enough to be there before, it's one of the greatest cities in the world at its height. It's a shadow of its former self, but people love to go there, and he knew that. It was also a place where he could bring students from mainland. All of his students, when I went and talked to him, all of his students were from mainland. He had like one Hong Kong student and one postdoc from the US. And again, the goal was they needed to be able to pursue, have access to outside information, have access to outside databases. If you're going to be playing with AI, you need to be able to, get access to. And so the Great Firewall actually was difficult for folks doing early AI research. They hadn't actually created some carve-outs where they started to create for the big tech companies where they could just sort of get their own access. But if you were setting up a university program at that time, you really couldn't be in mainland and do AI. The access to sort of the global internet and data and transfer of information, you couldn't functionally do there. So that's why he launched it. But he also launched a company called SenseTime. Folks who are unaware, SenseTime is the premier AI unicorn in the PRC. You can track back China's really powerful AI cluster, including the guys who run ByteDance's algorithm and created the TikTok algorithm, the ones who took Musical.ly's and actually made it world class. Those were all folks he trained. They were folks who worked at SenseTime. And there's a whole slew of companies that spun off from this Hong Kong SenseTime nexus. And so it really remains a really important vector even today. People still, academics still see Hong Kong as this place where okay, it's difficult to go and partner with the, Harbin Institute of Technology because they've been put on the entity list, but no Hong Kong universities are on anybody's entity list, right? So there's still this sense that, that's a place to just do basic research. But that research goes into this sort of techno-industrial complex, which is very centric on national security, which I'm sure Peter will talk about. But SenseTime's first customers were the ministries of public security, right? They were doing facial recognition, image recognition. When I first walked into their offices in 2016, my first time experience, and then now no one thinks about it, but 2016, when you walked in and the screen lights up and says, hey, welcome Rick Schweitzer, great to have you here. Your meeting's with so-and-so, it shows your face and walk to the left, you have a meeting with so-and-so, he's waiting for you in this conference room. In 2016, I was like, wow, that's kind of scary. I just walked in here and knew everything about me. And they showed us what their technology was up to, right? And they showed us Shanghai and a couple other places where, and one they showed us was, it was an officer, and I'm sure you've seen the press of this, an officer had glasses and actually saw somebody who was wanted for something at a train station and just picked them up, right? And their ability, they had predictive AI, they could predict, well, you had somebody who was walking in a crowd, but they weren't walking like everybody else, right? They were walking in a suspicious manner. And so they were flagged for the Ministry of Public Security to go snatch them up. And I asked them, what happened? It actually turned out it was nothing, but we're trying to perfect this, right? I mean, imagine you're walking down the street and then the camera's like, hey, you're walking in a suspicious way. I don't know what's up with you. Let's get the police over there. So these technologies are already being used to create digital repression very, very powerfully. So it's not just the technology, it's not just the competition piece, there's a human rights aspect here, right? So, we train Tong, Microsoft sends him over there. He creates this program. He maintains these partnerships. He spoke at a big AI conference in 2022 at MIT, his alma mater, and spoke glowingly about the kind of things we can do together. Well, the kind of things we can do together, here we have independent judiciary, right? You can sue people. You can go after them with freedom of information. Right there, that's the goal, is the state wants to control individuals and control their access to information, control who they talk to, control their ability to speak freely, to have a conscience, right? A political conscience, a religious conscience. All these things are, illegal, they're banned, right? And now you have this very powerful technology that we essentially, through the Hong Kong conduit largely, created for them, that is being marshaled against their own citizens on a daily basis. The human rights violations are deep and ongoing on a daily basis. They're not just against Uyghurs, which are terrible. I had the Uyghur portfolio in 4, 5, and 6. I traveled to Xinjiang. I went to Kashgar. I spent time in mosques. I can tell you firsthand, better than probably very few people who aren't Uyghurs themselves can tell you firsthand how bad it is. And that was way back when. But average Han Chinese are being repressed on a daily basis, right? And they know where the lines are. People are smart, they know what they can and can't say, but this sort of self-repression, you walk around every day, all day long, knowing that I got to be careful. Now it's like, and everyone lives through the internet now. And now it's even worse. Now you have this supercharged intelligence that is monitoring every little thing you do, say, where you go, who you interact with. It's really becoming almost Orwellian.
I'll just contribute. I left Beijing in 2015, then moved to Hong Kong for a couple of years. But journalists who more recently reported from Beijing for the Washington Post or other publications say that if they go to Tiananmen Square, they're immediately picked up by facial recognition technology and immediately tracked. And so if you're a journalist as well, they know exactly who you are, who you're speaking with, and can more immediately take steps to stop you from reporting. So Peter, some of our questions and some of my research for this panel, of course, focused on the Greater Bay Area Initiative. And Sunny Chung has written for the Jamestown Foundation that the synergy between Hong Kong's international status and the Pearl River Delta's robust innovation infrastructure is creating a dynamic ecosystem to rival that of Silicon Valley. What is the GBA, and how is it, along with Hong Kong, serving as a test bed for technology development, and why is this important? What significance does it have for us here in the United States?
So I think what Sunny wrote was what the party's aspirations for the Greater Bay Area are. It's not there yet, but that is their hope. The Greater Bay Area Initiative is more than a decade old at this point, but it was really formalized in a 2019 sort of official outline, Gangyao, that sort of explained in great detail what they're hoping to accomplish. To simplify it down, though, they kind of had three big pieces to it. The first was to ensure that the Hong Kong people share in the historic responsibility of contributing to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, right? So it's very clearly that political and social and cultural aspect of what Hong Kong is. The second, and this gets to what Rick was saying about the conduit for access to technology and basic research, is very explicitly Hong Kong is still a way for China to access basic research internationally, right? This is the kind of thing that the PRC system, the way that it politicizes things, is very difficult for the party to make a decision on, right? Because basic research essentially is looking into things that don't have an answer yet. You're kind of looking out and prospecting to say, what is possible here, right? And that's something where our system, with a sort of a more meritocratic proposal process, can say, here's some money, go try something, right? But they need more results. They want the metrics, and basic research cannot pan out. It can fail, right? And it's not because it was a bad project. It's not because it was bad scientists. It's not because of the lab. It's simply because maybe that wasn't the right avenue to go down. But where they've put their emphasis is on the applied science and the engineering, and how do you go from the breakthrough to a product, and to do it as quickly as possible. So in this respect, if their university systems and their innovation ecosystem is not great at basic research, and it's having to tap in internationally to this broader global system, Hong Kong is still a critical element of how the PRC can tap basic research. And the Greater Bay Area Initiative is about, especially on its technological aspects, is really about making sure that Hong Kong's innovation system is much more closely aligned and tapped into what is taking place inside the PRC. So in other words, it's kind of like, in one sense, it's trying to have a Hong Kong face on a sort of a PRC engine behind it. And so that anything coming through Hong Kong is going directly into these collaborative partnerships between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, between things elsewhere in Guangdong province. And then the last thing that the Greater Bay Area Initiative is about using Hong Kong to support the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the interesting things is that when you look at the decline in PRC government loans to projects under the under the Belt and Road Initiative, they started, where I first encountered the Greater Bay Area Initiative was looking at Hong Kong tycoons who were being brought to these United Front events under the Greater Bay Area Initiative. And it essentially looked like that Beijing was trying to raid the tycoons' pockets to use their money, to use Hong Kong money to support loans for infrastructure projects further afield,
drawing from both of your recent answers, Rick, here this whole day focuses in large part on the ongoing crackdown in Hong Kong. And things have changed really rapidly and precipitously over the last few years. How does this impact Hong Kong's role in Beijing's technology absorption strategy? And how does it impact this larger role of Hong Kong serving as a bridge and this fundamental part of testing innovation and testing these new things?
Hong Kong, as Peter said, Hong Kong still plays a pretty critical role. If I might, Peter's right. The dream is that the Greater Bay Area will rival Silicon Valley, and in some ways, they don't. But in some ways, they're far beyond. And so, if you think about hardware innovation, if you think about actually building things, right? If you think about autonomous drones, or you think about a Tesla vehicle and its ability to drive autonomously. Those are all made in the Pearl River Delta, right? The components, the key critical components. There are highly complex motherboards and PCB systems that go into all these things that really can only be made at scale in that part of southern China. There's a reason why DJI, and again, the founder of DJI actually came up with the idea in a dorm room in Hong Kong, right? And so this ability to sort of flow quickly, right? The drones he saw initially, they were sort of from the United States, and they were mostly science projects. And he saw one, and he was a very technically competent guy. He was doing his degree in that field, and he's like, oh, I can tear this down and start making it in my dorm and start selling it. But all he had to do was go across, the bay and drive into Shenzhen and go into the electronics markets there. And what he found was everything that he needed and everything that Silicon Valley needs is actually coming from there, right? And so it's already this really powerful nexus. Because again, as I said earlier, Hong Kong brought, large numbers of Western, European, US technology firms into southern China. And then eventually the Taiwanese came in as sort of relations got a little bit nicer, and they did so on behalf of US technology companies, actually. Folks who remember far enough back, but you used to see there were only a few US-made computers in the 80s, and it was mostly Japanese, and they were much cheaper than US variants. And all of a sudden, these IBM clones came out, right? And what the IBM clones were, they were Taiwanese firms making the US companies' computers for them. But eventually, what happened was that Taiwan got so big. The market for those electronics that Taiwan was making for the United States got so big that the Taiwan companies had to come to China. And that's sort of when the next wave of Taiwan, but what that sort of, I only bring up Taiwan in that it played a dual role with Hong Kong in creating this really powerful technology superpower, to be quite honest with you. I mean, there are certain kinds of components at scale that only come from that Pearl River Delta area, and Hong Kong built that, right? If there's no Hong Kong, you don't have that today. It just simply doesn't exist. And so that important role, and I mentioned more cutting edge technology with AI and others, but we can't forget that that's the hardware components manufacturing center of the planet is right there for low end components that make everything from F-150 Lightnings to F-35s work, right? And it's sort of important to keep that in your mind. They already have a very powerful hand that they're playing with, and so the last kind of piece is this, the really high-end technology and the innovation side of things that they're sort of missing, and that's where Hong Kong continues to this day to play that important role. Now, since the ongoing repression that's gotten worse and worse, and the national security laws and other things that have come into place, the luster is off of Hong Kong. The permissiveness is sort of fading. It's not what it once was to them. I've always been amazed, if you're thinking from a strategy perspective, whatever they thought they gained by going after Hong Kong and trying to like force their sort of political will on the Hong Kong people, they lost tenfold in what they lost in this role, this special carve out that Hong Kong had for customs, for trade, for innovation, for firms, for technology, so many things. That Hong Kong played this incredibly powerful role that drove the creation of China's innovation system. We're now in jeopardy because of that. So,
but it's also worth noting, though, right? it has continued to work for them. At the same time that universities and research institutes worldwide have cut back their exposure to the PRC, have trimmed back their research programs, have kind of their own embedded research security process to look at what kind of collaborations are taking place, that same diligence is not necessarily applied to Hong Kong. It's still treated as something a bit different. So, you know, this is one of those areas where when we think about what the China model is today, it is about drafting off of international basic research. And one of these central questions that Beijing is grappling with, and one of the reasons why they're using Hong Kong the way that they are, is that this is still the way to get access to basic research, because Hong Kong is still treated somewhat differently by research institutions. We're not as skeptical of what is taking place in Hong Kong as we would be with a collaboration with, you know, not even just the Harbin Institute of Technology, but sort of the leaders like Tsinghua University and Shanghai Jiaoda and the like.
I'll turn it to the audience in just a minute, but building off of what you just said, Peter, what kind of loopholes in U.S. regulations is Hong Kong exploiting, and for you both, in its investment in emerging technologies now?
I think the biggest loophole is really just our own skepticism, right? I mean, we've not applied entity listings to Hong Kong universities, to Hong Kong institutions for the same reasons that we have to PRC ones, even though it's very clear, and you can see it in the outline on the Greater Bay Area Initiative, you can see it in their policies, that they are looking at Hong Kong institutions as being integrated into the military civil fusion development strategy, and also into the innovation-driven development strategy, which has been around for about a decade longer. And these are two fundamental strategies that the PRC is using to build its comprehensive national power. They are specifically about this, right? Military civil fusion is about ensuring that the PLA can become a world-class military in the 2030s, and ensuring that basically that technological innovation can contribute to the broader economy and to the military simultaneously. And we've gotten through our head that we should be cautious of MCF programs when it comes to dealing with the PRC, but we haven't yet expanded our mind to say, well, wait a minute, actually Hong Kong is a part of this, and it's explicitly and increasingly tied directly into that system.
Yeah, I would just reiterate exactly what Peter said, which is that it's really us making a distinction where there's no difference, right? We decide that sort of internally, and I get it, you know, many of us have very fond memories of Hong Kong. And so we feel, well, aren't we just precipitating, you know, the inculcation of Hong Kong? If we shun Hong Kong, you know, if we put these restrictions on it, aren't we just sort of further isolating Hong Kong and inculcating it into the PRC? And I think, unfortunately, you know, this isn't something we control anyway, right? And so I think we just need to be, you know, very sort of realistic about why it's being used, how it's being used. And, you know, as I just said a minute ago, you know, what China gained from imposing sort of its political will and putting its boot on the Hong Kong people, it lost so much on the technology side. Well, what we're gaining by sort of turning a blind eye, it's the exact opposite of it for us, right? By turning a blind eye and pretending it's business as usual wherever we possibly can, we're enabling the PRC to continue to gain real benefit from Hong Kong in ways that, you know, the people of Hong Kong don't want. Certainly, you know, the U.S. military and the Pentagon doesn't want to happen. And even academics, so I've spent a lot of time with American academics and European academics talking this problem for, you know, almost 20 years now. Even they, when you talk to them, I talked to the, you know, a very senior person at MIT not long ago. And, you know, he was like, well, look, we don't want people to come here and not stay and not become a part of the process. We want good, smart people to come and stay. But if there's a way to figure out who's gaming the system, then we'd love for you to like not give them a visa, for instance. And my whole point of that is not, this is not a visa issue, but is that, you know, if we know that it's primarily being gamed in ways that undermine our national security, then we kind of have to bite the bullet and be willing to impose much tougher sanctions. And knowing that maybe that does precipitate, you know, the inculcation of Hong Kong into mainland China, but that's just sort of the world anyway, and accepting the world for its sort of, you know, sad realities is part of being a grown-up, in my opinion. So.
Okay, great. So I'd love to turn to any questions from the audience. Yes, in the back there, please.
Hey, thank you. My name's Catherine Early. I work with the International Republican Institute, and there were several things that you mentioned that I really related to. Growing up, I was one of the foreign permanent residents in China. I was a minor, but I think it was like one of those, it was that like sweet golden period where it was a really good experience. I also related to the idea that many Chinese have never met a foreigner before, and that's diminishing a lot. There were some like towns we would go to where kids were really scared of us because they thought we were ghosts, and to be fair, I understand. But the other thing I noticed was knowing what the red lines were. So even me, like I was a foreigner, I was going to an international Christian school, but when I came back to America, there were a lot of things that I didn't realize were kind of controlling, that I myself knew what the red lines were, and I wasn't able to realize that until I was back in America, and those didn't apply to me. And so one of the biggest dilemmas, I think, with Hong Kong or China is how do you apply those sanctions and the knowledge that things are bad and we're not going to continue business, but also try to, like, how do you break that isolation? Because I think that's when that's the water people are swimming in, they don't realize that it doesn't have to be that way.
So I think one thing, and I think this is something that from my time on the Hill, and certainly I think CFHK's Executive Director, John, feels it with me, is that we didn't succeed in creating a pipeline for Hong Kongers that needed to be protected, and that we failed then. We should still try to fix it and create it and make it work. The second is that we still haven't really figured out for services like VOA and RFA how to consistently get them into places that the PRC does not want to. I mean, a great example of how we think we're in a narrative fight, and that if we just create the narratives, that will work. But it's really a fight over platforms and the movement of information. And a great example that took place in Hong Kong is that we relied on a company called AsiaSat to broadcast VOA into the PRC. And through proxies, the PRC brought a controlling interest and then decided not to renew the satellite broadcast rights. So all of a sudden, that capacity was cut off. And you can see things with data privacy and the movement of data in and out of Hong Kong. You can see the slow movement toward more and more control. And I think while we still have some openness, we should be thinking about how do we create that broadcast capacity? How do we create, let's call it a samizdat capacity to get written material through and to keep printing? I mean, those are things that have been done. We've done them in the past, but we've just kind of stagnated as we've thought about this, I think, too much in the narrative space and not enough in this sort of physical platform space about how things move.
Yeah, I mean, the red lines are getting deeper. I mean, we mentioned that, and I think and I completely agree with Peter's platform point. TikTok is a platform of so unfettered, direct access to every kid's mind in America, but we can't get Voice of America over a cable channel that nobody watches in mainland anyway. Be nice to have something, but it's pales in comparison to 2 a.m. with every 12-year-old in the country versus versus maybe somebody tunes in. But as far as the red lines, though, if you look at what they have done with arresting people, they've created new red lines for people, right? When you make an example of somebody, it's a great Chinese idiom. It's one of my favorite Chengyus. It's the 杀鸡给猴看, right? And so you kill the chicken, let the monkey watch. But that's some of what they're doing, going after these Hong Kong students and literally extraditing them. Right, these students aren't a threat, but what they're doing is they're creating red lines in people's minds. Right, people are self-censoring; they know what not to do now, and that's sort of the real sad part about what's happened, and that we didn't do enough early enough to really make it painful to do some of the things that they did in ways that maybe may have given them pause, because now everybody knows. You're not going to have some of the students, and you wouldn't do that. Why would you risk putting yourself in prison for the rest of your life simply by standing up and asking for free speech? It's just people now know the red lines, just like people in Shanghai have always known the red lines.
For one more quick question.
I appreciate Rick talked very clearly about the asymmetry of the world goes to China versus China open to the world. Because I came from a company working for railway business. I know exactly what you said regarding all the technology absorbed by China, but then kicked out of the market of China. So based on this kind of your view, for the entrepreneurs or say companies still want to keep cooperating with China, do you have any comment or advice for them when they do business with China? Because right now we see the Apples, the Elon Musk, they just keep doing business with China so happily, and in order to get some benefit or say economic benefit from there. But from long run, I see so terribly for they set up an example for the entrepreneurs, the company outside, that China is a good place to invest, to do business. I want to, do you have any word to them according to your view? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I helped companies do business in China 20-something years ago. I even consulted with a Chinese state-owned enterprise back in the 90s and telling them how to do business in the United States, so I have some background. Unfortunately, the real answer is it's going to require government action. The only way you can sort of rebalance the terms of trade, there's nothing an individual entrepreneur can do, bottom line, unfortunately. One of the things I came up with for a company called Divix was, at the time, China couldn't make digital signal processors. And the company Divix was an MPEG-4 video compression company. Basically, they let you stream video at small rates so you could watch it over the internet. They wanted to sell into China, said you can't possibly make money in China, they won't pay you. But what we can do is you can put your technology into chips made in Taiwan, and you make the Taiwanese pay you before you go. So there's always some potential workaround for a handful of folks. What you have to realize is that if the market's open, they're never going to open it more than 20%. And you can sort of follow any new market where they let foreigners get a certain amount. It always regresses back to maybe 20% of the market, so that 80% is for Chinese firms, 20% for foreign firms. So you leave just enough open so that you have constituencies in foreign governments arguing the maintenance of the open market for the Chinese firms. So what they want is to give just enough, open just enough of China so that you open completely to them. That's the sort of, and so only governments can fix that. Governments have to come in and say, look, there's no reciprocity. These are mostly state-directed and state-backed firms. The financing is all state-directed and state-backed, even if these are quasi-private firms. And so, Huawei's gotten, well, I think some studies, $120 billion in subsidies going way, way back to help them become the firm that they become. And so what you have to say is, look, you get only as much of our market as we get of yours. You get almost only as much access to our market in terms of trade as we get of yours. And I think if we just simply did something like that, the TikTok, Twitter issue, where Twitter's not allowed, Facebook's not allowed, but TikTok can do whatever it wants, right? What we're sort of facing now with new energy vehicles, we certainly faced with electronics and a whole bunch of other things. Solar panels is a great one as well, where it was just almost impossible to really do business through a number of non-tariff barriers and window guidance. There are just so many ways an authoritarian regulatory state like the PRC has at its disposal to really make it almost impossible. And so unfortunately for entrepreneurs, the real answer is get together, get with your governments and say, you know what, we can't trade 20% of their market for 100% of our market, right? That's not a winning scenario for anybody.
Something quick.
I think just a quick comment to keep in perspective and why it requires government action is that the PRC has something like 34% of the world's manufacturing capacity and roughly 11% of the world's demand. To keep their system even partially functional requires them dumping on international markets. So as long as that is the fundamental reality, it requires government action, and anything else is simply going to leave companies swamped and vulnerable to the predatory economic policies of Beijing.
Thanks so much, everybody. I think we're just out of time, but I really appreciate y'all taking the time. It's fascinating today.
Thank you so much to our speakers and panelists. Thank you. It's really, really interesting discussion that I think worth a lot more attention and studying. And so thank you so much to our speakers. We just had 3 amazing panel discussions today, and you can find how everything and all 3 of the topics kind of intertwine with each other. Because you can't talk about the sanctions evasion, the export of technologies and goods, and the military-civil fusion strategy without talking about China, without talking about how China is also using these technology to threaten media freedom and honestly all other aspects of freedoms. And so we hope that we're able to do this in this symposium, that we're doing it every year to tie everything together. And on that, I want to thank you again to all of the speakers and moderators once again for doing such a great job in presenting that and for their time in studying on these important issues. Please give them a round of applause. Now, I would like to invite our chairman, Ambassador James Cunningham, back to the podium to provide to close this. And after that, I will come back with a few more items for your attention. So please make sure to stick along. Ambassador Jim Cunningham.
I also want to spend the gratitude of the CFHK Foundation and my personal gratitude to all the panelists and the discussions today. I thought it was a really illuminating and thought-provoking series of discussions. To go back to a point that I made at the outset when I first spoke, it's the right and decent thing, the moral thing to do to oppose oppression in Hong Kong. It is just the way it should be. But I think what we saw in today's discussions, as I hinted in my opening remarks, is that the United States and its partners around the world have real political and economic interests at stake in Hong Kong as well. And I think that's a theme that ran through the discussions about what happens when you take freedom of information away. What does that mean for the ability of businesses to operate in China and Asia? What happens when Hong Kong becomes a center of illicit transfer of technology and financing? And what happens when above-board transfer of technology and education and financing risks becoming weaponized in a very, very real way against the United States and our partners? All these things are happening now in Hong Kong. And I take the point that a number of our speakers raised, that it's the way to deal with this. We try to influence companies and institutions and all kinds of things, but the real way to influence all this has to be through government action. And I've felt for a long time, as I think also came out in some of the discussion, that what's happening in Hong Kong is really a small scale part of a much bigger problem that we're dealing with that has to do with Russia and Ukraine, with China's global aspirations, with the aspirations of Iran in the Middle East. And North Korea, they are now becoming united in a way that's historically unique and poses a unique historical challenge for the United States that, frankly, I think is not sufficiently well appreciated yet in our body politic and in our publics. And Hong Kong is part of that because it's being used in that struggle in its new configuration as not Asia's world city. As I also said earlier, I think if China at some point comes to desire that Hong Kong can play more of that kind of role in the future, a legitimate role in promoting development and prosperity in the region, and a prosperity for the Chinese people that I spent my time in Hong Kong trying to promote in 2005 to 8. If that's the kind of Hong Kong that China decides it wants, then we need to see concrete action that begins to restore some degree of democracy and freedom in Hong Kong that the people of Hong Kong very much deserve and desire. And that begins with the release of political prisoners. So thank you all very much for coming. It's been a great morning and a long morning, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Cunningham. Thank you for your remarks and also your leadership in the organization.
剛才係前駐港總領事郭漢明再一次就今日嘅研討會呢，就做一個總結啦。咁佢就話其實美國喺香港一樣係有利益有關嘅地方。咁尤其是佢舉咗例子嘅，你喺而家香港嘅環境，當資訊唔透明嘅時候，金融財經嘅風險，咁係咪對美國對全世界美國嘅盟友都一樣係有影響呢？咁Cunningham 認為其實而家香港嘅情況，美國面對緊嘅要處理嘅問題，其實只不過係一個整體環球大問題之下嘅一個縮影，一個微縮影。所以佢話香港唔再係以前嗰個亞洲嘅世界嘅金融中心，而家已經變成咗一個被北京被俄羅斯、北韓、伊朗等利用係要嚟做制裁規避，係利用嚟被北京要嚟達成佢偉大民族復興呢個任務入邊其中一個步驟嘅一個元素。如果香港真係要變翻做 Asia World City， 即係一個世界嘅大都會國際金融中心，其實香港以前就係呢個咁嘅角色，就係不但止令到中國人係可以得到繁榮富庶，其實對全世界人都有好處。嗰個就係以前嘅香港。咁呢個就係剛才即係前駐港總領事 James Cunningham 嘅一個結語嘅總結啦。咁可以再趁而家呢個時間呢，亦都總結一下今日呢個研討會後半嘅兩個環節，大概傾咗啲乜啦。咁第二個環節呢，即係頭先喺嗰個小息之後，其實就係講香港被變成咗一個洗黑錢嘅中轉站。咁牽涉到嘅除咗俄羅斯之外，其實仲有北韓同伊朗。咁兩位主講者其實都有呢個研究啦，即係包括就係Sam Beckett 佢其實就寫咗一份報告咧，就係講究竟點樣喺香港佢哋利用啲空殼公司，就以貿易作為佢哋嘅即係一個招牌，作為一個即係遮掩，但係背後其實就係為俄羅斯提供戰爭需要嘅物資啦，亦都係調翻轉呢，亦都係向北韓、伊朗甚至乎中國大陸咧，就提供佢哋需要嘅技術。咁香港喺中間作為一個中轉站嘅角色，其實最重要嘅一點呢， 就係所謂嘅銀行嘅資金往來，就係所謂嘅 trade finance。所以 Sam Beckett 就提出，如果要有效咁樣去阻止香港進行呢一啲活動呢，當然最有效直接，但係亦都係後果係最強烈、最猛烈嘅一個做法呢，就係直接對相關嘅銀行進行制裁。咁但係就算唔對相關銀行進行制裁，都可以退一步，就係以呢個 primary money laundering concern 嘅 destination， 即係話香港係一個首要有洗黑錢嘅需要被關注嘅地方。俾咗呢一個標籤之後呢，美國嘅銀行同香港嘅銀行進行交收嘅時候，就一定將會更加係需要做盡職審查嘅時候，就做得仔細好多。咁亦都會連帶令到香港嘅銀行又好，美國嘅銀行又好咧，唔係咁容易去進行呢一啲涉嫌係會幫被制裁國家咧去洗黑錢或者係進行貿易嘅一啲交易。咁另外最後一個環節呢，其實就係講科技喺而家嗰個環境 emerging technology 即係一啲新嘅尖端嘅科技，對於中國同埋對於香港，其實當中香港扮演緊一個乜嘢角色？咁兩位講者由都幾遠開始講起啦，就係話喺改革開放之前，甚至乎改革開放之後，其實中國嘅開放係選擇性嘅對世界開放，但係中國自己向外邊嘅擴張呢，就基本上係完全冇節制、冇制約。喺呢種不對等嘅所謂開放之下，就出現咗一個情況，就係外國嘅企業、外國嘅人要進入中國大陸係非常之難，就只能夠唯有透過香港。不過另外一邊廂，中國大陸佢哋就喺世界各地咧就開始佈置佢哋嘅偉大民族復興嘅一個佈局。講者亦都有提醒到啦，佢就話中共本質上就係一個列寧式嘅政黨啦，佢有三個重要啦。三個任務呢，一個就係民族嘅復興啦，另外一個呢，就係要進行統一大業啦，最終就係要即係民族嘅崛起啦嚇，即係稱霸啦。咁喺呢一個過程入邊呢，而家最爭咗嗰一步就係科技。咁而科技又要分兩部分，就係其實如果講生產製造嘅科技，其實喺香港隔離嘅深圳呢，就已經有足夠嘅條件去做所有嘢。但係佢哋整盤棋唯一爭咗嗰一步係乜呢？就係有創新同埋做一啲真係好基礎研究嘅人才。而呢一點正正就係香港所彌補到嘅，因為你要吸引呢啲人才，其實中國大陸本身係冇任何移民政策，佢哋唔可能啲人去到中國大陸呢變歸化變成中國人。你要將呢啲人才收納喺一個地方去進行呢啲基礎研究做創新工作，唯一嘅選擇就係香港。咁所以其實而家香港嘅幾個大學咧，本身就已經扮演緊呢個角色。講者就質疑，究竟美國嘅研究嘅中心、大學等等，係咪都需要考慮埋而家香港呢啲大學佢哋嘅定位同功能上面嘅轉變？係咪仲係當佢哋係以前嘅香港自由嘅香港之下嘅大學咁樣去處理，去應對佢哋呢？最後即係講者亦都有提到一點啦，就係話其實喺呢個 大灣區之下，其實香港同深圳嗰個角色定位，正正就係剛才講嗰種版圖，亦都即係而家個現實。咁佢亦都留翻個問題俾大家去考慮去思考啦。咁啊，今日就超過即係成4個小時嘅研討會啦。咁啊，由頭到尾咁有開頭有3個議員係發表佢嘅講話啦。咁之後中段有國會嘅資深議長啊 Pelosi 嘅講話啦，咁同埋3個研討會嘅，咁啊非常之多嘅資訊啦，咁啊希望大家都可以從中咧可以得到一啲唔同嘅信息。咁啊今日嘅分享啦，今日嘅節目咧就暫告一段落啦，咁就好多謝大家嘅收睇，咁啊有機會再見啦。